Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey unlike any other. Imagine stepping into a narrow alley in London where the fate of empires was decided over cups of bitter black liquid, where a shoemaker could debate philosophy with a baron, and where a single penny bought you entrance to the most dangerous and exciting intellectual space in the world. This is not a tavern. This is not a university. This is something far stranger. This is an 18th-century coffeehouse, and for the next few hours, you and I are going to spend one full night inside its smoky, chaotic, utterly fascinating walls. Before we step through that threshold together, I have a small request. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's strange and beautiful corners, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like, but only if the story truly speaks to you. I would also love to know where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed with the lights dimmed, on a long drive, somewhere quiet where you can let your mind wander? Drop a comment and tell me. I read every single one, and your words fuel these stories. Now, settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let the world outside fade away. And let us walk together into the London of 1750, into a place that no longer exists except in memory and shadow. The year is 1750. The city of London pulses with over 500,000 souls, making it the largest city in the Western world aside from Constantinople. If you were to stand in the heart of the financial district on a cold November evening, you would find yourself surrounded by a labyrinth of narrow passageways, each one barely wide enough for two people to pass without brushing shoulders. The air smells of coal smoke, horse manure, and something else, something rich and bitter and exotic: coffee. We are standing at the entrance to Change Alley, a passage so narrow you could stretch your arms and touch both walls at once, yet this cramped, unremarkable space is the beating heart of global finance. It is here, in this alley, no bigger than a football field, that the future of nations is bought and sold. It is here that fortunes are made and lost before the sun sets. And it is here that we will spend our night. The light is fading now. It is just past 6 in the evening, and the November darkness comes early. Lanterns flicker in windows, candles glow behind thick glass panes, and from every doorway comes the murmur of voices, rising and falling like a tide. If you listen closely, you can hear arguments about politics, about science, about the latest scandal involving a member of parliament. You can hear laughter. You can hear the rustle of newspapers being passed from hand to hand, and underneath it all, you can hear the clink of coffee cups on saucers. But before we enter, we need to understand what we are about to step into, because an 18th-century coffeehouse is not like the Starbucks on your corner. It is not a place to grab a quick caffeine fix and check your phone. It is something altogether different. It is a social experiment. It is a revolution, and in many ways, it is the birthplace of the modern world. The first coffeehouse in England opened in Oxford in 1652. It was established by a man named Jacob, and it catered to the strange and curious scholars of the university who had heard rumours of this new beverage from the Ottoman Empire. 2 years later in London, a Greek servant named Pasqua Rosé opened the first coffee house in the city at St. Michael's Alley in Cornhill. Londoners did not know what to make of it at first. The drink itself was, by all accounts, absolutely vile. One trader described it as being black as soot and tasting not much unlike it. Another account called it a newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor. The beans were over-roasted, often burnt. The grounds were boiled rather than brewed, and the resulting liquid was thick, gritty, and shockingly bitter. You drank it with the coffee grounds still swirling in the cup. There were no lattes, no caramel drizzle, no oat milk, just pure, unadulterated, throat-scorching coffee. And yet, despite the taste, people could not stop drinking it, because coffee did something that no other beverage could do. It woke you up. It sharpened your mind. It turned your thoughts from fog to crystal. In a society where the primary social beverages were beer, ale, and wine, where people drank alcohol from breakfast to bedtime simply because water was often unsafe, coffee offered something radical. It offered sobriety. It offered clarity. It offered the ability to think. By 1739, there were over 550 coffee houses in London alone. Each one had its own character, its own clientele, its own unwritten rules. Some were elegant and refined, with polished wood tables and well-dressed patrons. Others were rough and rowdy, filled with sailors and dock workers and men on the fringes of society. But all of them shared one remarkable feature. For the price of 1 penny, any man could walk in, sit down, and join the conversation. 1 penny. That was it. For that single copper coin you received a cup of coffee, access to all the newspapers and pamphlets in the house, the right to sit by the fire for as long as you wanted, and most importantly, the right to speak. It did not matter if you were a duke or a ditch digger. It did not matter if you owned land or owned nothing but the clothes on your back. Inside a coffee house, rank was supposed to dissolve. Everyone was equal, or at least that was the dream. The French writer Maximilien Misson visited London in the late 1600s and described the coffee houses with wonder. "You have all manner of news there," he wrote. "You have a good fire, which you may sit by as long as you please. You have a dish of coffee. You meet your friends for the transaction of business, and all for a penny if you do not care to spend more." It sounded almost utopian, a place where information flowed freely, where ideas could be exchanged without fear, where a working man could educate himself simply by listening to the conversations around him. The coffee houses earned a nickname that stuck. They were called penny universities. But here is the thing about utopias. They are never quite as perfect as they seem, because even as the coffee houses opened their doors to men of all classes, they kept those doors firmly shut to half the population. Women were not allowed, not as customers anyway. A few women owned coffee houses or worked as servers, but the vast majority were excluded from this vibrant public space. The official reason given was that coffee houses were places of serious political and intellectual discourse, and such matters were not the concern of respectable women. The unofficial reason was more complicated. There was a lingering suspicion that any woman who entered a coffee house alone must be a prostitute. The very act of crossing that threshold marked you as improper, as transgressive. And so the women of London watched from the outside as their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons spent hours, sometimes entire days, in these mysterious establishments. In 1674, a satirical pamphlet appeared titled The Women's Petition Against Coffee. It claimed to speak for the frustrated wives of London, and it did not hold back. The pamphlet railed against the newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee. It accused the drink of making men unmanly, of sapping their vitality, of turning them into pale, hollow-eyed creatures who cared more about debate than about their families. But historians today suspect that the pamphlet was not actually written by women at all. It was likely penned by members of the church or by tavern owners who resented the competition. It was satire, designed to mock the coffeehouse culture by pretending to give voice to angry wives. Whether real or fake, the pamphlet reveals a deeper truth. The coffeehouses were changing society, and not everyone was happy about it. Now, let us step forward. It is time to cross the threshold. We are standing at the entrance to one of the coffeehouses in Change Alley. The door is heavy oak, darkened with age and smoke. Above it hangs a painted sign showing a steaming cup. There is no name on the sign. You are simply expected to know which coffee house this is by reputation, by word of mouth, by the type of people who gather here. You push open the door and immediately you are hit by a wall of sensation. The heat is the first thing you notice. A roaring fire burns in the hearth, and combined with the press of bodies, the room feels almost tropical. The air is thick with smoke, not just from the fire but from dozens of clay pipes. Tobacco smoke hangs in lazy blue clouds near the ceiling, drifting in and out of the candlelight. And underneath it all is the smell of coffee. It is bitter and burnt and strangely spicy. Nothing like the smooth, roasted aroma of modern coffee. It smells harsh. It smells foreign. It smells, quite frankly, a little unpleasant. But it also smells like possibility. The room is packed. Men sit at long wooden tables, shoulder to shoulder, some leaning forward in animated conversation, others hunched over newspapers, their lips moving silently as they read. There is no separation by class here, at least not in theory. A man in a finely embroidered waistcoat sits next to a man in a rough wool coat. A lawyer with ink-stained fingers debates with a ship captain whose face is tanned from months at sea. Across the room, a young clerk argues passionately with a grey-haired scholar about something you cannot quite make out. The noise is overwhelming. Everyone seems to be talking at once, and no one seems to be listening. As you step inside, a voice calls out, "What news have you?" It is a custom, you realise. Every newcomer is expected to bring information, to contribute to the collective pool of knowledge. Some coffee houses greet customers with the more formal phrase, "Your servant, sir. What news from Tripoli?" In the Latin coffee house they shout, "Quid novi?" What news? It is not just a greeting, it is a demand. Information is currency here, more valuable than gold. You make your way to the bar, a simple wooden counter near the entrance. Behind it stands a woman, one of the rare few allowed in this male domain. She is the proprietor, a widow perhaps, or the wife of the owner. She looks at you with sharp, appraising eyes. "1 penny," she says. You hand over the coin and in return she slides a small ceramic cup across the counter. The coffee inside is black as pitch, and when you take your first sip, it is every bit as terrible as you've been warned. It is bitter, gritty, scalding hot. It tastes like burnt wood and dirt, but you feel it almost immediately. A warmth spreading through your chest, a sudden clarity in your thoughts. This is not a drink. This is a tool. This is a weapon against sleep, against dullness, against the fog that settles over the mind after too much ale. With your cup in hand, you find a seat at one of the long tables. No one looks up, no one acknowledges you. In a coffee house, it is understood that you do not need an invitation to join a conversation. You simply sit down and start talking, or you sit down and listen. The choice is yours, and so you listen. The man to your left is reading aloud from a newspaper. It is the Daily Current, one of the many papers that circulate through the coffee houses. He reads in a clear, carrying voice, pausing occasionally to let the words sink in. The news is from France. There is talk of a new treaty, of shifting alliances, of war on the horizon. The man to your right interrupts. He does not believe the report. He thinks it is propaganda, designed to manipulate public opinion. A third man joins in, offering a different interpretation. Soon half the table is involved, each person contributing a fact, a rumour, a personal experience that either supports or refutes the claim. It is chaotic, it is messy, but it is also electrifying. This is democracy in its rawest form. This is the free exchange of ideas, unfiltered and uncontrolled. You glance around the room and notice the walls. They are covered with notices, advertisements, announcements. One poster advertises a sale of imported silk. Another offers lessons in French and Italian. A third announces an upcoming lecture on astronomy. And tucked between them all are handwritten notes, some requesting information, others offering services. There is even a small bag hanging on the wall, its mouth open like a fish. It is a mail slot. Many men use coffee houses as their mailing addresses. Letters arrive here, are sorted, and are handed over to the recipients when they next visit. It is more reliable than the official postal system and far more convenient. But the most remarkable thing about this room is not the coffee or the newspapers or the conversations. It is the people themselves. Look around. Truly look. At that table near the window sits a man in the black robes of a clergyman, deep in conversation with the Jewish merchant. At the table by the fire, a young student from Cambridge argues with a retired naval officer. In the corner, a poet scribbles in a notebook, occasionally glancing up to eavesdrop on nearby discussions. And there, near the door, is a man who might be a spy, a government informer sent to listen for seditious talk. Or maybe he is just a curious bystander. It is impossible to tell. This is the paradox of the coffee house. It promises equality, but it also breeds suspicion. It offers freedom of speech, but it also creates a surveillance society where anyone might be listening, where any careless word might be reported to the authorities. In 1675, King Charles II became so worried about the subversive potential of coffee houses that he issued a proclamation for the suppression of coffee houses. He called them nurseries of sedition and murmuring. He feared that the free exchange of ideas would lead to rebellion, to revolution, to the overthrow of the monarchy. And perhaps he was right to fear. His own father, King Charles I, had been executed during the English Civil War. The memory of that bloody conflict was still fresh. And here, in these coffee houses, men gathered to discuss politics without censorship, without oversight. It was dangerous. It was thrilling. But the king's proclamation backfired spectacularly. The public outcry was so intense, so unified, that Charles was forced to rescind the order just 11 days later. The coffee houses had won. They had proven that once people tasted freedom of speech, they would not willingly give it up. The coffee houses remained open, and they continued to grow. By the middle of the 18th century, they were not just social spaces. They were institutions. They were the engines of the Enlightenment. You sit there sipping your terrible coffee, and you realize something. This room, this cramped, smoky, chaotic room is changing the world. The conversations happening around you are not idle chatter. They are the seeds of scientific discovery, of literary masterpieces, of political movements that will reshape nations. In this very coffee house, or one just like it, ideas are being born that will outlive everyone in this room. And you are here, a witness to it all, for the price of 1 penny. The candles flicker, the fire crackles, the voices rise and fall. And you understand, perhaps for the first time, why people call these places penny universities. Because education is happening here. Not the formal, structured education of Oxford or Cambridge, but something wilder, something more democratic. Here, a poor man can learn about science from a gentleman. Here, a tradesman can debate theology with a scholar. Here, knowledge is not locked behind the walls of institutions. It is available to anyone willing to listen, willing to think, willing to engage. But as you sit there, absorbing the atmosphere, you also sense the contradictions. This place claims to welcome all men, but it excludes all women. It claims to value reason and sobriety. But the debates can turn vicious, personal, even violent. It claims to be a space of equality, but you can see that the men in finer clothes still command more respect, still have their opinions heard more readily. The coffee house is a beautiful experiment, but it is a flawed one. It is human in all the messy, complicated ways that humanity expresses itself. Outside, the night deepens. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral chime the hour. It is 7 o'clock. You've been in the coffee house for less than an hour, but already you feel as though you have lived a dozen lifetimes. The conversations continue, the newspapers circulate, the coffee flows, and you realize that this is only the beginning. There are hours yet to go before dawn, and so much more to discover. Each coffee house has its own secrets, its own stories, its own strange cast of characters, and we're going to visit them all. But first, we need to understand the substance at the centre of it all, the coffee itself. Because this drink is not just a beverage, it is a medical mystery, a subject of fierce debate, and a source of both hope and fear. In the next part of our journey, we are going to look more closely at what exactly is in that cup, why people could not stop drinking it despite its awful taste, and why some people believed it was a cure-all medicine while others thought it would kill you. The story of coffee in 18th century London is stranger and more fascinating than you might imagine, and it all begins with a simple question. Is this bitter black liquid a blessing or a curse? So let us turn our attention to the cup in your hand. Look at it. Really look at it. The liquid inside is almost black, so dark that you cannot see through it even when you hold it up to the candlelight. Tiny particles float on the surface, remnants of the coffee grounds that were boiled rather than filtered. The cup itself is crude ceramic, thick-walled and unglazed on the inside. There is no handle. You wrap your fingers around it and feel the heat radiating through the clay. This is your coffee. And if you are like most people in 1750 London, you're about to have a very complicated relationship with it. The first question everyone asks when they encounter coffee for the first time is simple. What does it taste like? And the honest answer, the answer that shows up again and again in letters and diaries and medical treatises from the period, is this. It tastes absolutely terrible. William Biddulph, a trader who encountered coffee in the Middle East before it reached England, described it as black as soot and tasting not much unlike it. That was one of the kinder descriptions. Others called it muddy, bitter, burnt, and resembling the taste of old shoes boiled in ditch water. One pamphlet from 1674 referred to it as a newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor. These were not people with delicate palates complaining about a slight bitterness. These were people genuinely shocked by how bad this drink was. But here is the strange part. Despite the awful taste, people kept drinking it. In fact, they could not stop drinking it. By 1663, just 11 years after the first London coffee house opened, there were already 82 coffee houses in central London alone. By 1739, that number had exploded to over 550. Something about this vile-tasting liquid was irresistible, and that something, of course, was caffeine. Now, the people of 18th century London did not know about caffeine. The compound would not be isolated and identified until 1820, more than 70 years in the future. But they absolutely felt its effects. They felt the way it sharpened their thoughts, the way it drove away sleepiness, the way it made hours of conversation feel effortless and exciting. In a society where most people drank some form of alcohol throughout the day, where water was often unsafe and ale was the beverage of choice from breakfast onward, coffee offered something revolutionary. It offered clarity. Think about it. If you spent your morning drinking small beer, your afternoon drinking wine, and your evening drinking port or brandy, your mind would exist in a permanent fog. You would function, certainly. People did, but you would not be sharp. You would not be quick. Coffee changed that. For the first time, ordinary people had access to a stimulant that made them feel more awake, more alert, more capable of complex thought. And they noticed. Oh, they noticed. Coffee became known as the drink of reason. While alcohol dulled the mind and loosened inhibitions, coffee did the opposite. It focused you. It made you want to engage in debate, to read, to think deeply about complicated subjects. This is why the coffee houses became intellectual powerhouses. It was not just the social atmosphere, it was the drug itself, the caffeine flooding through everyone's system, creating a room full of people who were wired, alert, and ready to argue about absolutely anything. But caffeine was not the only reason the people drank coffee. There was another factor, and it was medical. In the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee was widely believed to have medicinal properties. And I do not mean mild health benefits. I mean serious, disease-curing, life-saving properties. The medical establishment was genuinely divided on whether coffee was a miracle cure or a dangerous poison, and the debates got heated. On one side, you had the coffee enthusiasts. These were doctors and natural philosophers who believed that coffee could treat an astonishing range of ailments. According to various medical texts from the period, coffee was said to cure something called head melancholy, which we might today call depression. It was said to cure drunkenness, which makes a certain amount of sense given that it counteracts alcohol's effects. It was claimed to treat gout, scurvy, and even smallpox. Yes, smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases of the era, and some doctors genuinely believed that drinking coffee could help. The reasoning behind these claims was based on the medical theory of the time, which held that the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease occurred when these humours became imbalanced, and the goal of medicine was to restore balance. Coffee, being hot and dry in nature according to this system, was thought to counteract cold and wet humours. If you were suffering from melancholy, which was caused by an excess of black bile, a cold and dry humour, then coffee's hot and dry properties should theoretically balance you out. It made perfect sense if you accepted the underlying theory. Even before coffee houses became popular, serious scientists were experimenting with coffee. Francis Bacon, the great philosopher and scientist, conducted experiments on coffee's effects before the beverage was widely available in England. He was fascinated by its properties and wrote about it in his natural histories. The fact that someone of Bacon's stature took coffee seriously lent it enormous credibility. But not everyone was convinced. On the other side of the debate were doctors and moralists who believed that coffee was actively harmful, and they had their own list of terrifying side effects. Coffee, they claimed, could cause tremors if consumed in high doses. It could contribute to heart problems. It could lead to paralysis. One experimentalist worried that prolonged coffee drinking would cause the nerves to become overstimulated and eventually fail altogether, leaving the drinker unable to move or think clearly. There was also a more scandalous claim, and it showed up in that infamous pamphlet from 1674, The Women's Petition Against Coffee. The pamphlet alleged that coffee made men unmanly. It claimed that the drink had a drying effect that sapped men's vital fluids and left them weak, pale, and unable to fulfill their marital duties. The language was surprisingly explicit for the period. The pamphlet described husbands as nothing worth, being mere eunuchs due to excessive coffee consumption. Whether this was genuine concern or satirical exaggeration is hard to say. Most historians believe the pamphlet was a joke, a piece of satire designed to mock the coffeehouse culture by pretending to give voice to frustrated wives. But the fact that such claims could be made, even in jest, shows how little people understood about this foreign substance. So who was right? Was coffee a cure-all or a poison? The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Coffee does have genuine medical effects. Caffeine is a stimulant that increases alertness and can improve cognitive function. It can help alleviate certain types of headaches. It can counteract the depressant effects of alcohol. So the coffee enthusiasts were not entirely wrong. But coffee also has real side effects. In high doses, caffeine can cause tremors, anxiety, insomnia, and heart palpitations. It can be genuinely dangerous for people with certain heart conditions. So the coffee critics were not entirely wrong either. But here is what makes this debate so fascinating. Neither side had any understanding of the actual mechanism at work. They did not know about caffeine, they did not know about neurons or neurotransmitters or how stimulants affect the brain. They were fumbling in the dark, trying to explain the effects they observed, using a medical framework that was frankly completely incorrect. And yet through trial and error and careful observation, they managed to figure out some truths. Coffee does make you more alert. It does help with certain ailments. It can also cause problems if you overdo it. They were right about the effects, even if they were wrong about the causes. Imagine being a doctor in 1700, trying to understand this bizarre new substance. Your patients come to you complaining of shaking hands after drinking too much coffee. Do you diagnose them with an imbalance of hot and dry humours? Do you prescribe bloodletting to restore balance? Or do you simply tell them to drink less coffee? Some doctors did exactly that. They recognized that moderation was key, even if they could not explain why. There is a wonderful story about Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry and a regular at London coffeehouses. Boyle was fascinated by coffee and conducted his own experiments. He would vary the amount he drank, the time of day he drank it, and the method of preparation. He kept meticulous notes on how each variation affected his ability to think and work. He was, in essence, conducting one of the first scientific studies of caffeine's effects on human cognition, and he did not even know he was studying caffeine. He just knew that this drink did something to his brain, and he wanted to understand it. But let us return to the taste, because that is the part that truly baffles modern coffee lovers. How could something that tastes so terrible become so popular? Part of the answer is that 18th century coffee was prepared very differently from modern coffee. The beans were often over-roasted, sometimes burnt. This was partly intentional. The burnt flavour was thought to enhance the medicinal properties, but it also happened because roasting was an imprecise art. There were no temperature controls, no timers. You roasted the beans over an open flame until they looked dark enough, and if you went too far, well, that was just how it was. Once roasted, the beans were ground into a coarse powder. Then, instead of brewing the coffee by passing hot water through the grounds, as we do today, they simply boiled the grounds directly in the water. Imagine making a pot of tea, but instead of using a tea bag, you just dump loose tea leaves into boiling water and let them steep until the liquid is almost black. That is essentially how coffee was made. The result was a thick, sludgy beverage with grounds floating in it. You drank it grounds and all, people would take a sip, swish it around their mouths to strain out the worst of the grit and swallow. It was unpleasant, but it was also undeniably effective. Some coffee houses tried to improve the taste by adding spices. Cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg were common additions. These spices not only masked some of the bitterness, but also added their own exotic appeal. Remember, spices were expensive and associated with wealth and sophistication. A cup of spiced coffee was a luxury item, even if the base liquid tasted like burnt wood. Others added sugar, which was also expensive but increasingly available thanks to the brutal sugar trade from the Caribbean plantations. Sugar helped tremendously with the bitterness, and sweetened coffee became the preferred drink for many patrons. But purists insisted that real coffee should be drunk black, bitter and strong. Adding sugar was seen as a sign of weakness, a failure to appreciate the drink's true character. Sound familiar? The same debates we have today about how to properly drink coffee were already raging in the 1700s. There was also chocolate, which some coffee houses served alongside coffee. Chocolate had arrived in England around the same time as coffee, and it was prepared in much the same way. Boiled, unsweetened, and served hot in tall cups. If you could afford it, chocolate was actually considered a more refined drink than coffee. It was associated with the aristocracy and the very wealthy. Coffee, by contrast, was more democratic. It was cheaper, more readily available, and therefore more popular among the middle and working classes. But whether you drank coffee, chocolate, or some tea, which was also gaining popularity, the point was not really the beverage itself, the point was the space. The coffee house gave you an excuse to sit, to talk, to read, to think. The drink was just the price of admission. And that brings us to something important. The coffee may have tasted awful, but the experience was extraordinary. Have you ever been somewhere that changed the way you think? A place where the conversations were so stimulating, so unexpected, that you walked away feeling like your brain had been rewired. That is what the coffee houses offered. Yes, the coffee was bitter and gritty and burnt, but the ideas were fresh, the arguments were sharp, the information was new, and for many people that was worth choking down a terrible tasting beverage. There is also something to be said for the ritual of it. Humans are creatures of habit, and the act of sitting down with a cup of something hot, even if that something is objectively disgusting, creates a sense of comfort and routine. The coffee houses became part of people's daily lives. You went there to catch up on the news, to meet friends, to conduct business. The coffee was just what you drank while you did those things. Over time, your brain would start to associate the taste of coffee with the pleasure of the experience. And eventually you might even start to enjoy it, or at least you would stop noticing how bad it tasted. This phenomenon is actually well documented in modern psychology. It is called acquired taste. When you first try something bitter or sour, your brain registers it as potentially dangerous. Bitterness often signals poison in nature. But if you keep consuming that substance and nothing bad happens, your brain recalibrates. It learns that this particular bitter thing is safe, even enjoyable. The same process happens with coffee today, with beer, with dark chocolate, with blue cheese. All of these are objectively unpleasant on first taste, but we learn to love them. The people of 18th century London were going through this process in real time. Coffee was new, it was surreal, it tasted awful, but it made them feel good. It brought them together, and it opened up the new worlds of thought and conversation, and so they learned to love it. Or at least they learned to tolerate it enough to keep coming back. There is one more aspect of coffee's appeal that we should not overlook, and that is its exotic origins. Coffee came from far away, from the Ottoman Empire and beyond. It was associated with distant lands, with trade routes, with the expansion of European power across the globe. When you drank coffee in 1750 London, you were participating in a global economy. The beans in your cup had travelled thousands of miles, passing through the hands of farmers in Yemen or Ethiopia, traders in Constantinople, merchants in Venice or Amsterdam, and finally arriving in London. Every sip connected you to this vast interconnected world. It made you cosmopolitan, sophisticated, a citizen of the world rather than just a resident of your neighbourhood. This sense of worldliness was part of the coffee house appeal. You were not just drinking a beverage, you were participating in something larger, something modern, something that marked you as part of the new intellectual elite. Even if you were just a clerk or a shopkeeper, inside the coffee house you could feel like a philosopher, a scientist, a man of importance. And so, despite the terrible taste, despite the medical debates, despite the moral panic and the satirical pamphlets, coffee conquered England. It became woven into the fabric of daily life. It changed the way people socialized, the way they conducted business, the way they thought about the world. And it all started with this bitter black liquid that tasted like burnt dirt. Now, you might be wondering, did no one try to make better coffee? Did no one experiment with different roasting techniques or brewing methods? The answer is yes, some did. But remember, coffee was still relatively new to Europe. The science of roasting and brewing was in its infancy. It would take another century or more before coffee preparation became refined into the art we know today. In 1750 you took what you could get, and what you got was burnt, boiled and bitter. But it worked. And sometimes that is enough. As you sit there in the coffee house draining the last gritty sips from your cup, you realize something. This terrible tasting drink has become the fuel of a revolution. A revolution in thought, in commerce, in politics, in the very structure of society, and the people around you, choking down their bitter brews and arguing about philosophy or trade or the latest scandal, are the revolutionaries. They just do not know it yet. But we are only scratching the surface. We have talked about the coffee and the basic atmosphere of the coffee houses, but we have not yet explored what made these places truly special. We have not yet understood why they were called penny universities, or what kind of education happened within these walls. Because the coffee houses were not just drinking establishments, they were schools, they were laboratories, they were places where ordinary people could learn things that had previously been reserved for the elite. And in the next part of our journey, we are going to step deeper into that world. We are going to see what happened when a shoemaker could sit down next to a baron and debate the nature of the universe. We are going to explore the radical, beautiful, messy experiment in democratic education that made the coffee houses unlike anything that had come before. Picture this moment. It is now approaching 8 o'clock in the evening, and the coffee house has reached its fullest capacity. Every seat at every table is occupied. Men stand in clusters near the walls, leaning in to hear conversations over the general din. The air has grown thicker, warmer, more electric with possibility. And at the table directly in front of you, something remarkable is happening. Something that would have been impossible anywhere else in England. A shoemaker is arguing with a baron about the nature of gravity. The shoemaker's name is Thomas. You do not know his surname because no one has asked. In a coffee house, surnames are optional. What matters is not who your father was or what title you inherited, but what you know and how well you can defend your ideas. Thomas has calloused hands stained with leather dye. His coat is worn at the elbows, but right now he is holding his own in a debate about natural philosophy with a man who owns 3 estates and commands the loyalty of hundreds of tenants. The Baron, whose name is Sir William something or other, has just finished explaining his understanding of Sir Isaac Newton's theory of universal gravitation. He speaks with the confidence of a man who attended Cambridge, who studied under private tutors, who has access to the latest scientific texts. But Thomas is not intimidated. He listened carefully, and now he raises a question. If gravity pulls all objects toward each other, why do the planets not simply crash into the sun? Why do they maintain their orbits? It is a good question, a genuinely insightful question. And Sir William pauses, considers, and then attempts an answer involving centrifugal force and the balance of attractions. Thomas nods slowly. He is not convinced, but he is thinking. Around them, other men have stopped their own conversations to listen. Because this, right here, is what the penny universities are all about. This is why people called these places the most democratic institutions in England. The term penny university was not just a clever nickname. It was a genuine description of what happened in these spaces. For 1 penny, the price of a cup of coffee, any man could enter and receive an education that rivaled what was available at Oxford or Cambridge. Not the same education, mind you. There were no formal lectures, no examinations, no degrees awarded. But there was something perhaps more valuable. There was access to ideas, to information, to people who knew things you did not know. And in the intellectual economy of the 18th century, that access was priceless. Let me give you a sense of scale. In 1750, if you wanted to attend Oxford or Cambridge, you needed several things. First, you needed to be male. That goes without saying. Second, you needed substantial wealth. Tuition, room, board and fees could easily cost £50 to £100 per year, roughly equivalent to the entire annual income of a skilled tradesman. Third, you needed the right social connections. Universities were not meritocracies. They were finishing schools for the sons of gentlemen. If you were born into the working or even middle classes, higher education was simply not an option for you. But the coffee houses asked for 1 penny. That was it. No background check, no letter of recommendation, no proof of gentle birth. Just 1 penny and you were in. You could sit at the same tables as university graduates, as physicians, as lawyers, as merchants who had travelled the world. And you could listen, you could learn, and if you were brave enough, you could speak. The things taught in coffee houses were astonishingly diverse. Some coffee houses specialised in particular subjects. There were coffee houses frequented by scientists and natural philosophers, where discussions of astronomy, physics and chemistry dominated. There were literary coffee houses where poets and playwrights debated metre and meaning. There were political coffee houses where every decision of Parliament was analysed and criticised. And there were merchant coffee houses where the talk was all of trade routes, commodity prices, and the latest ventures. But even beyond these informal specialisations, coffee houses offered structured education. Yes, actual lessons. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, many coffee houses hosted teachers who would offer instruction in specific subjects for a small additional fee. You could learn French, Italian or Latin from a tutor who set up shop in a corner of the coffee house. You could take lessons in mathematics, useful for merchants and accountants. You could study astronomy, fencing, dancing or the art of gentlemanly deportment. Some coffee houses had resident music masters who would give lessons on the violin or harpsichord in upstairs rooms. Think about what this meant for someone like Thomas the shoemaker. He could not afford university. He could never hope to hire a private tutor. But if he was curious, if he was willing to sit in a coffee house for a few hours each week, he could learn Latin. He could learn enough mathematics to understand commerce and navigation. He could read newspapers and pamphlets that exposed him to ideas from across Europe. He could listen to educated men discuss natural philosophy and slowly piece together an understanding of the physical world. It was not formal education, but it was real education nonetheless. The diarist Samuel Pepys captured this atmosphere beautifully in his journals. Pepys was a naval administrator and a member of the Royal Society, the premier scientific organisation in England. He was well educated, well connected, a man of considerable importance. And yet he loved the coffee houses. In 1660 he discovered the Rota Club, a philosophical society that met at the Turk's Head Coffee House. Pepys described the experience with genuine awe. He wrote of admirable discourse and exceeding good arguments. These were not stuffy academic lectures. They were living, breathing debates where ideas collided and sparked and occasionally caught fire. The Rota Club was founded by James Harrington, a Republican political theorist whose ideas were considered dangerously radical. The club met to discuss politics, philosophy, and governance. They debated questions like whether a republic was superior to a monarchy, how power should be distributed in an ideal state, and whether democracy could ever truly function. These were not abstract academic questions. England had just lived through a civil war. King Charles I had been executed. The monarchy had been restored. People had died over these very ideas. And here, in a coffee house, ordinary citizens could debate them openly. Of course, the Rota Club did not last long. It was dissolved after the Restoration when discussing Republican ideas became too dangerous. But the model persisted. Other clubs formed in other coffee houses. The discussions continued. The government could shut down individual clubs, but it could not shut down the culture of free inquiry that the coffee houses had created. One of the most famous examples of coffee house education involved the Royal Society itself. Founded in 1660, the Royal Society brought together the greatest scientific minds in England. Isaac Newton was a member. Robert Boyle was a member. Christopher Wren, the architect who rebuilt London after the Great Fire, was a member. And where did these brilliant men meet to discuss their latest discoveries? Very often in coffee houses. The Grecian Coffee House, located near the Royal Exchange, became particularly associated with scientific discussion. It was here that members of the Royal Society would gather informally between official meetings. And it was here, according to one account, that Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley once dissected a dolphin on a table while other patrons watched and asked questions. Can you imagine? You walk into a coffee house expecting to read the newspaper and have a cup of coffee, and instead you get a free anatomy lesson from two of the greatest scientists of the age. That was the magic of the penny universities. But the education offered in coffee houses was not limited to high-minded scientific discourse. Practical knowledge was equally important. A young man hoping to enter trade could learn about different markets, about the realities of shipping and commerce, simply by listening to experienced merchants talk shop. Someone interested in the law could hear lawyers debate cases and precedents. An aspiring writer could learn the craft by listening to established authors discuss their work. There was also the newspapers. Oh, the newspapers. This might be the single most important educational tool the coffee houses provided. In 1750, newspapers were becoming increasingly common, but they were still expensive for individuals to purchase. A single issue might cost several pennies, a significant expense for a working man. But coffee houses subscribed to multiple papers and made them available for free to all patrons. You could walk into a coffee house and read half a dozen different newspapers in a single sitting. London papers, provincial papers, foreign papers translated into English. You could learn what was happening in Parliament, in the courts, in the streets. You could read about wars in Europe, trade negotiations with the Americas, scientific discoveries, theatrical performances, scandals involving public figures. This access to information fundamentally changed English society. Before coffee houses, news was controlled by a small elite. If you were not wealthy or well-connected, you simply did not know what was happening beyond your immediate neighbourhood. But the coffee houses democratized information. They created an informed public sphere where ordinary people could participate in discussions about national and international affairs. And that informed public sphere, historians argue, was essential to the development of modern democracy. Consider the impact this had on social mobility. If you were born poor but intelligent and curious, the coffee houses offered you a path to self-improvement. You could not buy your way into the upper classes, but you could educate yourself. You could learn how the wealthy thought, how they spoke, what they knew. You could acquire cultural capital, and in some cases, that education could lead to real opportunities. There are documented examples of men who started as apprentices or clerks, educated themselves in coffee houses, and eventually became successful merchants, writers, or even members of parliament. But let us be honest about the limitations, because while the coffee houses claimed to be egalitarian, they were never truly equal. Yes, a shoemaker could sit at the same table as a baron, but that did not mean they were treated as equals. The baron's opinion still carried more weight. His education was still respected more. His accent, his clothing, his bearing all marked him as superior. The shoemaker could participate in the conversation, but he could never forget his place. And there was another, much more glaring limitation. Women were excluded, completely. With very rare exceptions, no respectable woman could enter a coffee house as a patron. The penny universities were for men only. This meant that half the population was barred from this incredible educational opportunity. It did not matter how intelligent a woman was, how curious, how eager to learn. The door was closed to her. Some women found ways around this. There are stories, probably apocryphal but possibly true, of women dressing as men to sneak into coffee houses. There are accounts of women standing outside coffee houses, listening through windows or doors. And of course, some women owned or managed coffee houses, which gave them at least some access to the conversations, even if they were not supposed to participate. But these were exceptions. For the vast majority of women, the penny universities might as well have been on the moon. This exclusion is one of the great paradoxes of the Enlightenment. The same society that celebrated reason, progress, and universal human rights also maintained strict barriers based on gender. The same men who argued passionately for political equality among classes saw nothing wrong with excluding women from public intellectual life. It was a blind spot so enormous that it is hard for us to understand today, but it was real, and its effects were profound. Still, within their limitations, the penny universities were revolutionary. They created a space where ideas could flow across class boundaries, where autodidacts could flourish, where curiosity was valued more than pedigree. And the ripple effects of this intellectual ferment were enormous. The scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the political revolutions that would reshape Europe and America in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, all of these were fueled in part by the coffeehouse culture, by the idea that knowledge should be accessible, that debate should be free, that ordinary people had the right and the ability to think for themselves. As you sit there in the coffee house watching Thomas the shoemaker hold his own against Sir William the Baron, you realise you are witnessing something historic. This is not just an interesting conversation. This is the birth of a new kind of society. A society where your birth does not determine your intellectual life, where information is a public good rather than a private privilege, where a penny can buy you not just coffee, but a seat at the table of human knowledge. The clock on the wall chimes the half hour. It is 8:30 now, and the evening is still young. The debates continue. The newspapers circulate, the coffee flows, and you find yourself thinking about all the other conversations happening in all the other coffee houses scattered across London. How many brilliant ideas are being shared right now? How many lives are being changed by a chance encounter, an overheard discussion, a newspaper article read in the flickering candlelight? But the penny universities, remarkable as they were, tell only part of the story. Because while some coffee houses were temples of learning and rational discourse, others were something quite different. The coffee houses were not all high-minded. Some were deeply connected to the messy, dangerous, exciting business of news gathering and news spreading. And that is where we turn next. To understand how these establishments became the nerve centres of information in an age before telegraph, before telephone, before internet. To understand how a simple coffee house could become the place where the fate of nations was decided, where fortunes were made and lost, where the course of history was shaped by rumour, gossip, and the desperate human hunger to know what was happening in the world beyond the walls. There is a sudden commotion near the door. The conversation in the coffee house does not stop exactly, but it shifts the way a flock of birds shifts direction mid-flight. Everyone's attention pivots toward the entrance. A man has just burst through the door, his coat damp from the light rain that has begun to fall outside. He is breathing hard as though he has been running, and in his hand he clutches a folded piece of paper. "What news have you?" someone shouts from across the room. It is the ritual greeting, but this time there is genuine urgency in the voice, because this man, this breathless courier, is what they call a runner, and runners do not run unless the news is important. The man catches his breath, holds up the paper, and announces in a voice loud enough to carry over the din. The king is returned from Hanover. His ship made port at Greenwich this morning. He brings word from the German states. There is movement of troops near the border with France. The room erupts. Not with panic, but with the peculiar electricity of people who suddenly have something important to discuss. Men cluster around the runner, peppering him with questions. What else did he hear? Who was on the ship? What does this mean for English foreign policy? And most importantly, is this information reliable? Welcome to the information economy of 18th century London, where news was not something that appeared on your phone or your computer screen, but something that moved at the speed of human feet, where a piece of paper carried from one coffeehouse to another could change the direction of markets, the outcomes of elections, the fates of nations, where knowing something an hour before everyone else could make you rich, and knowing something false could ruin you completely. The coffeehouses were not just places where news was consumed, they were where news was created, verified, distributed, and most importantly, weaponized. They were the internet of their age, the social media platforms, the news aggregators, and like modern social media, they were simultaneously brilliant and dangerous, democratic and chaotic, empowering and misleading. Let me explain how this system worked, because it is both simpler and more complex than you might imagine. In 1750 there was no CNN, there was no BBC, there were newspapers, yes, but they came out only a few times per week, and by the time they were printed and distributed, the information was already hours or even days old. If you wanted to know what was happening right now, you went to a coffee house. Because the coffee houses had runners. Runners were men employed by coffeehouse owners, or sometimes just ambitious individuals hoping to earn tips, whose job was to circulate through the city collecting information. They would go to the docks to hear what ships had arrived and what news they brought from foreign ports. They would go to the Royal Exchange to learn about changes in commodity prices. They would go to Westminster to catch wind of parliamentary debates. They would go to the courts to hear about legal decisions. And then they would literally run from coffeehouse to coffeehouse, sharing what they had learned. The system was remarkably efficient. A ship could dock at the Port of London, and within an hour every major coffeehouse in the city would know about it. A vote in Parliament could be announced, and within 2 hours men in coffeehouses across London would be debating its implications. This was unprecedented. For the first time in human history, ordinary people had access to news that was nearly instantaneous. Not quite real-time, but close enough that it changed everything. But here is the crucial thing. The runners were not journalists in the modern sense. They had no editors, no fact-checkers, no standards of verification. They simply passed along whatever they heard, and it was up to the coffeehouse patrons to decide what was true. This meant that rumour and fact flowed together in an undifferentiated stream. A runner might bring accurate news about troop movements in one breath, and completely false gossip about a member of parliament in the next breath. And unless you had independent sources of verification, you had no way to tell which was which. This created a market for information literacy. The men who frequented coffeehouses became experts at evaluating sources. They learned which runners were reliable and which exaggerated. They learned to cross-reference information from multiple sources before acting on it. They learned to read between the lines, to detect bias, to separate probable truth from probable fiction. In other words, they developed the exact same skills that we need today to navigate social media. The technology has changed, the challenge has not. Some coffeehouses went beyond simply receiving news from runners. They became active participants in the news-gathering apparatus. They employed their own informants. They cultivated relationships with ship captains, government clerks, merchants, anyone who might have access to valuable information. The best coffee houses became known for the quality of their intelligence, and men would pay a premium to frequent them. Edward Lloyd understood this better than almost anyone. His coffee house, Lloyd's, was located near the Thames docks and attracted primarily merchants and sailors involved in shipping. Lloyd realised that these men did not just want coffee, they wanted information. They wanted to know which ships had arrived, which had sailed, which had been lost at sea. They wanted to know about storms, pirates, blockades, anything that might affect their cargoes and their profits. So Lloyd started publishing a newsletter. It was called Lloyd's List, and it began in 1696 as a simple sheet of paper listing ship arrivals and departures, but it quickly evolved into something more comprehensive. Lloyd's List provided information about ship conditions, about losses at sea, about which captains were reliable and which were not. It became the authoritative source for maritime news, and crucially it was only available at Lloyd's Coffeehouse. If you wanted access to Lloyd's List, you had to buy your coffee from Edward Lloyd. This was genius. Lloyd had created what we would now call exclusive content. He had given his customers reason to choose his coffeehouse over all the others, and it worked spectacularly. Lloyd's Coffeehouse became the centre of the maritime insurance trade. Underwriters, the men who agreed to insure ships and cargoes for a fee, would gather at Lloyd's to assess risks and make deals. They had access to better information than anyone else, which meant they could make better decisions. And slowly, over decades, Lloyd's Coffeehouse evolved into Lloyd's of London, which is today one of the largest and most important insurance markets in the world. All because one coffeehouse owner understood that information is power. But Lloyd's was unusual in its level of organisation. Most coffeehouses operated on a more informal basis. They relied on a different kind of information infrastructure. They relied on the coffeehouse itself serving as a post office. Yes, a post office. This was another function of coffeehouses that is easy to overlook but was absolutely essential. In 18th century London, the official postal system was unreliable and expensive. Letters often went missing. Deliveries were slow. And if you were not wealthy enough to maintain a fixed address, receiving mail was nearly impossible. So people used coffeehouses as their mailing addresses instead. Here is how it worked. Bags or boxes were hung on the walls of coffeehouses, each one labelled with different categories. Letters would be delivered to the coffeehouse, sorted into the appropriate container, and held until the recipient came to collect them. If you were a merchant, you might give your correspondents the address of your favourite coffeehouse, rather than your home address. Your business partners, your family, your creditors, everyone would send their letters there, and you would stop by once or twice a day to check for mail. This system had several advantages. First, it was more reliable than home delivery. Coffeehouse owners had a vested interest in maintaining a good postal system because it kept customers coming back. Second, it was social. Collecting your mail gave you an excuse to sit down, have a coffee, catch up on the news. Third, it was flexible. If you travelled frequently or lived in temporary lodgings, you always had a stable address where people could reach you. But it also had implications for privacy, or rather the lack thereof. Your mail sat in an open bag where anyone could see the outside of the envelope. They could see who was writing to you, where the letters came from. In some cases, they could even see if you were receiving a lot of mail or very little, which might indicate your level of business success or social connection. Everything was public, everything was visible. The coffeehouses created transparency whether you wanted it or not. This transparency extended to the conversations themselves. Have you ever been in a coffee shop today and overheard someone's phone conversation, or seen someone working on a laptop where you could glimpse their screen? That same dynamic existed in 18th century coffeehouses, except amplified. Business deals were negotiated in the open. Political strategies were discussed where anyone could listen. Personal letters were read aloud to friends. There was very little notion of privacy in the modern sense. And this created opportunities for espionage. The British government knew perfectly well that coffeehouses were hotbeds of information exchange, and they took full advantage. Government informers, men paid to listen and report back, were a constant presence. They would sit quietly in corners, nursing their penny cup of coffee for hours, taking mental notes of who said what. Any talk that smacked of sedition, of disloyalty to the crown, or of sympathy for Jacobite rebels or Republican ideals could and would be reported. The most famous example of this occurred in 1696, when several patrons of Jonathan's Coffeehouse were implicated in a plot to assassinate King William III. The plot was discovered partly because informers in various coffeehouses had reported suspicious conversations. The plotters had thought they were safe speaking in coded language, trusting that the noise and chaos of the coffeehouse would protect them. They were wrong. Several men were arrested, tried and executed. The lesson was clear. The coffeehouses might feel like safe spaces, but they were anything but. Yet despite the risks, people kept talking, they kept sharing information, speculating, debating, because the hunger for news was stronger than the fear of surveillance. And as the 18th century progressed, newspapers became more sophisticated, more numerous, more central to coffeehouse culture. By 1750, London had dozens of newspapers, each with its own political bias, its own audience, its own agenda. There were Whig papers and Tory papers. There were papers that focused on foreign news, papers that specialised in scandal and gossip, papers that covered commerce and trade, and the coffee houses subscribed to as many as they could afford. Some of the larger, more prosperous establishments might take 6 or 8 different papers, and that they made them all available to customers for free, included in the price of that single penny cup of coffee. This was transformative. Think about what it meant. A working man, someone who could never afford to buy newspapers himself, could walk into a coffee house and spend an afternoon reading multiple perspectives on the same event. He could compare how the Whig paper covered a parliamentary debate versus how the Tory paper covered it. He could learn to detect bias, to read critically, to think for himself. This was media literacy education happening organically, driven by economic necessity and intellectual curiosity, but not everyone approved. The critics of coffeehouse culture argued that giving ordinary people access to so much information was dangerous. They worried that men without proper education would misunderstand what they read, that they would be swayed by demagogues, that they would become radicalized. These fears were not entirely unfounded. The coffee houses did radicalize people. They did spread seditious ideas. They did contribute to political instability. But they also created an informed citizenry, a public capable of holding their government accountable. And in the long run, most historians agree that was a net positive for democracy. There was also the phenomenon of reading aloud. Not everyone who came to coffee houses was literate. Literacy rates in 18th century England hovered around 60% for men and perhaps 40% for women among those few who had access to coffee houses at all. But illiteracy was not a barrier to accessing information, because literate patrons would read the newspapers aloud. Sometimes this was done informally, a man reading to a friend, but sometimes it was done deliberately, with someone taking on the role of public reader, delivering the news to a gathered audience like a performance. This oral culture of news created its own dynamics. A skilled reader could emphasize certain passages, interpret ambiguous text, add commentary and context. The news became filtered through personality, through performance. And this meant that the same newspaper could be understood quite differently depending on who was reading it aloud and what their agenda was. It was editorializing in real time, with no distinction between reporting and opinion. One fascinating detail from this era involves a practice called the quid novi greeting. In the Latin coffee house, which was frequented by scholars and students with classical educations, patrons would greet each other with the Latin phrase quid novi. It means what news? But it was more than just a greeting. It was a ritual that encapsulated the entire ethos of coffeehouse culture. You did not just come to consume information passively, you were expected to contribute. Everyone was both a receiver and a transmitter of news. The information economy was participatory, and this participation created a sense of community. Regular patrons of a coffee house would come to know each other, not by name necessarily, but by their information networks. You learned who had reliable sources at the docks, who had cousins in Parliament, who travelled frequently, and could bring news from other cities. You learned whose judgment to trust and whose to discount. The coffee house became your information ecosystem, and you were a node within it. But with all this information flowing so freely, there was also the problem of information overload. Even in 1750, people complained about having too much news, too many newspapers, too many rumours and reports to keep track of. They experienced what we might now call news fatigue. The constant stream of information was exhausting. Every day brought new crises, new scandals, new developments, and the lack of any filtering mechanism meant that trivial gossip was presented alongside genuinely important events. Some coffeehouse patrons dealt with this by specialising. They would focus only on the news that directly affected their business or their interests. A merchant might only pay attention to trade news and ignore politics. A literary type might devour reviews of new plays but skip over military dispatches. This specialisation created what we might call filter bubbles, though that term would not be invented for another 250 years. People could live in the same city, frequent coffee houses just streets apart, and yet inhabit completely different information worlds. As you sit there, watching the runner's news ripple through the coffee house, watching men debate its significance and implications, you start to understand something profound. The problems we face today with social media, with fake news, with information overload and filter bubbles and echo chambers, none of these are new. The technology is new. But the fundamental challenges of how humans process information, how we decide what to believe, how we navigate a world where everyone is both a publisher and a consumer of news, these challenges are as old as the coffee houses themselves. The candle on your table has burned down halfway. Outside, the rain has stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. It must be nearly 9 o'clock now, and you realise that we have barely scratched the surface of what happened in these spaces, because while some coffee houses were centres of learning and news, others were centres of something even more powerful and more dangerous: money. In the next part of our journey, we are going to step into the most chaotic, most exhilarating, most catastrophic coffee house in all of London. We are going to visit Jonathan's Coffee House, where the modern stock exchange was born, where fortunes were made in minutes and lost just as quickly, and where one massive fraud nearly destroyed the entire British economy. The story of what happened there in 1720 is one of greed, delusion, and financial disaster on a scale that is hard to imagine. And it all took place in a room not much bigger than this one. The energy in the room shifts as we leave behind the world of news and runners and turn our attention to something darker, something more dangerous, something that nearly destroyed the entire British economy. We are still in Change Alley, but now we are walking toward a specific address, a coffee house that looks from the outside no different from any other. But step through that door, and you enter a world where fortunes are made in minutes and lost just as quickly, where greed and delusion dance together, where the line between legitimate business and outright fraud becomes so blurred that no one can tell the difference anymore. This is Jonathan's Coffee House, and if you want to understand how a simple room where people gathered to drink coffee could give birth to the London Stock Exchange, to modern capitalism, and to one of the most spectacular financial disasters in history, you need to understand what happened here in the early 1700s, particularly in one catastrophic year. 1720, Jonathan's was opened around 1680 by a man named Jonathan Miles. Its location was perfect, right in the heart of Change Alley, Surrounded by the Royal Exchange and the offices of merchants and financiers, it quickly became the gathering place for a particular type of patron: stock jobbers. These were men who bought and sold shares in joint stock companies, the early versions of modern corporations, and they were not welcome at the Royal Exchange. Why? Because they had been thrown out, literally expelled for being too rowdy, too crude, too willing to bend the rules. So the stock jobbers moved to Jonathan's Coffeehouse and Garraway's Coffeehouse just down the alley. And there, freed from official oversight, they created something entirely new: an informal stock market. There were no regulations, no licensing requirements, no standards of conduct. Just men making deals across wooden tables, their word their only bond, their reputation their only currency, and it worked. For a while. It worked because most of the men involved understood that their future depended on maintaining trust. If you cheated someone today, no one would deal with you tomorrow. The system was self-regulating, held together by mutual self-interest. In 1698, a stockbroker named John Castaigne started doing something revolutionary. He began posting lists of stock prices at Jonathan's Coffeehouse. Every day he would write out the current prices for shares in the Bank of England, the East India Company, the Royal African Company, and other major enterprises. He would note what prices buyers were offering and what prices sellers were asking, and this simple act, writing down prices and making them public, transformed everything. Because suddenly there was transparency. Everyone could see what everyone else was paying. And that transparency created the foundation for a real market. Castaigne's price lists were so useful that he began publishing them in a newsletter called The Course of the Exchange. It became the first financial newspaper in England, maybe in the world, and it was distributed primarily through coffee houses. If you wanted to know what your investments were worth, you went to Jonathan's and checked Castaigne's list. The coffee house had become the beating heart of the British financial system. But transparency and trust can only go so far when enormous amounts of money are at stake. And in the early 1700s, the stakes became truly enormous. Because Britain was in trouble. The country had been fighting wars almost continuously for decades. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended in 1713, but it had left Britain drowning in debt. The government owed millions of pounds, and it had no clear way to pay it back. Different departments had borrowed money from different sources, often at ruinous interest rates. The whole system was on the verge of collapse. And then someone had an idea. A brilliant, audacious, ultimately catastrophic idea. What if you could convert government debt into shares in a private company? The government would no longer owe money to thousands of individual creditors. Instead, it would owe money to one company, and that company would give the creditors shares in exchange for their bonds. The creditors would become shareholders, and instead of receiving interest payments from the government, they would receive dividends from the company's profits. It was a debt-for-equity swap, though that term would not be invented for another 200 years. The company created to do this was called the South Sea Company, founded in 1711. And here is where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply corrupt. The South Sea Company was granted a monopoly on trade with South America and the South Sea Islands. This sounded fantastic. Imagine the riches. Spanish gold, exotic goods, unlimited potential. Except there was one small problem. Spain and Portugal controlled South America, and they had no intention of allowing British merchants to trade freely in their territories. The monopoly was essentially worthless, but that did not matter, because the real business of the South Sea Company was never trade. It was debt conversion. It was financial engineering. It was, to be blunt, a confidence game. The directors of the South Sea Company understood something crucial. They did not need the company to actually make money. They just needed people to believe it would make money, because if people believed, they would buy shares. And if people bought shares, the price would go up. And if the price went up, early investors would make enormous profits, and those profits would convince even more people to buy shares. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, what we would now call a bubble. And where did this bubble inflate? At Jonathan's Coffeehouse. Starting in 1719 and accelerating through 1720, Jonathan's became the centre of a financial mania unlike anything England had ever seen. The place was packed from morning until night, not just with professional stock jobbers, but with everyone, aristocrats and servants, clergy and criminals, men who had never invested in anything suddenly scrambling to buy South Sea shares. Because everyone knew someone who had made a fortune. Everyone had heard the stories. Let me paint you a picture of what Jonathan's looked like during the height of the South Sea bubble. Imagine walking in on a morning in July 1720. The room is so crowded you can barely move. Men are shouting, trying to make themselves heard over the din. At one table, a bishop in clerical robes is negotiating to buy shares, his hands trembling with excitement. At another table, a farmer from the countryside, his face still ruddy from the sun, is counting out gold coins, his entire life's savings, to purchase a stake in the South Sea Company. In the corner, a lawyer is explaining a scheme to buy shares on credit, using shares you do not yet own as collateral to borrow money to buy more shares. It is financial alchemy, turning nothing into something. And the prices. Oh, the prices. In January 1720, South Sea shares were trading at around £128 per share. By February, they had climbed to 175, by March over 300, by May over 500, and by June they reached an absolutely insane peak of over £1,000 per share. In 6 months, the stock had increased in value by nearly 800%, and people were still buying. Because surely it would go higher, surely this was just the beginning. Have you ever been caught up in something where everyone around you is getting excited, and you start to feel like you are missing out if you do not join in? That is FOMO, fear of missing out. And in 1720, everyone in England was experiencing FOMO on a scale that is hard to imagine. Even Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds in history, got caught up in the mania. He bought South Sea shares early, made a profit, and wisely sold. And then, watching the price continue to climb, watching other people make even more money, he could not resist. He bought back in at the peak, and he lost a fortune, reportedly £20,000, equivalent to millions today. Afterward, Newton supposedly said, "I can calculate the movement of stars, but not the madness of men." But the madness at Jonathan's Coffeehouse went beyond just buying South Sea shares. The bubble created a fever for speculation in general. Dozens of new companies were formed, each one promising incredible returns. And I do mean incredible. Some of these companies had business plans so absurd that you would think no one could possibly take them seriously. But people did. There was a company for extracting silver from lead, a company for trading in human hair, a company for, and I'm not making this up, a purpose to be announced later. That last one actually attracted investors. People paid real money for shares in a company that openly admitted it had no business plan. This proliferation of ridiculous schemes worried the government, not because they cared about protecting investors, but because they feared the competition might draw money away from the South Sea Company, in which many government officials had personal financial stakes. So Parliament passed the Bubble Act in June 1720, which made it illegal to form a joint stock company without a royal charter. The act was supposed to shut down the fraudulent schemes, but what it actually did was spook investors. Because suddenly people started wondering, if the government is worried about fraud, maybe some of these companies are fraudulent. Maybe the South Sea Company itself is fraudulent. The bubble burst in September 1720. The price of South Sea shares, which had reached £1,000 in June, collapsed to 175 by September. Thousands of people were ruined, life savings evaporated, estates that had been in families for generations were lost. Some people committed suicide. The scandal was enormous. Several members of Parliament and government ministers were found to have accepted bribes from South Sea Company directors. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Postmaster General, even some mistresses of King George I had been given shares and financial incentives to promote the scheme. The corruption went to the highest levels of government. It fell to Robert Walpole, who became First Lord of the Treasury in the aftermath, to clean up the mess. Walpole was one of the few major political figures who had not been directly implicated in the scandal. He devised a plan to restore confidence. The wealth of the 33 directors of the South Sea Company was confiscated and redistributed to the victims, though it covered only a fraction of the losses. The company itself was not dissolved. In fact, it continued to exist for more than a century afterward, gradually transformed from a fraudulent speculation into a legitimate administrator of government debt. But its reputation was destroyed forever. And Jonathan's Coffeehouse? It survived the scandal. Stock trading continued there, though in a more subdued atmosphere. The wild speculation was gone, replaced by a more cautious, more professional approach. In 1748, Jonathan's burned down in a massive fire that destroyed much of Change Alley. It was rebuilt, but by then the stock jobbers were beginning to formalise their operations. In 1761, a group of 150 brokers and jobbers formed a club to trade stocks, and in 1773 they built their own building and called it the New Jonathan's. But that name did not last. It was soon renamed the Stock Exchange. And that stock exchange eventually became the London Stock Exchange, one of the largest financial markets in the world. So Jonathan's Coffee House gave birth to modern finance, but it also revealed something dark at the heart of that system. The ease with which greed can override reason, the way markets can become detached from reality, the potential for those with inside information and political connections to exploit everyone else. These are not historical curiosities. These are warnings. The South Sea Bubble happened 300 years ago, but the patterns it revealed, the human behaviours it exposed, those have not changed. Every major financial crisis since then, from the tulip mania in the Netherlands to the dot-com bubble to the housing crisis of 2008, follows the same basic script. Initial success creates excitement. Excitement attracts new investors. Rising prices justify more excitement. Eventually, prices become disconnected from any rational valuation. And then some small piece of bad news or sudden loss of confidence triggers a collapse. And people who were convinced they were getting rich discover they have lost everything. As you sit in Jonathan's Coffeehouse at 9:30 on this November evening in 1750, 30 years after the bubble burst, the memory is still fresh. The men here speak of it in hushed, almost reverential tones. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when caution is abandoned in pursuit of easy wealth. But even as they tell these stories, even as they shake their heads at the folly of their predecessors, you can see the same light in their eyes, the same hunger, the same belief that maybe, just maybe, they could be the ones to get rich, that they are smarter, more careful, more deserving of fortune. Human nature does not change. We make the same mistakes over and over, just with different assets and different excuses. But Jonathan's is not the only coffee house where commerce and community intersected in fascinating ways. Just a short walk from here, closer to the Thames, there is another establishment with an equally remarkable story. A place where the smell of tar and salt mingles with the aroma of coffee, where ship captains and underwriters gather to assess risk and negotiate insurance, where reliable information is more valuable than gold. We are going to leave the world of speculation and fraud behind, at least for now, and enter a different kind of financial space. One built not on dreams and delusion, but on trust and careful calculation. We are going to Lloyd's Coffeehouse and the story of how one man's newsletter created a global institution that still exists today. And we leave the coffeehouse on Change Alley and step back into the narrow passage. The rain has stopped, but water still drips from the eaves overhead, catching the light from lanterns hung on iron brackets. The air smells clean, washed, but underneath the freshness is that ever-present London smell. Coal smoke, horse manure, the Thames at low tide. We are walking now, making our way through the labyrinth of alleys that connect the financial district, and we are heading toward the river, toward the docks, toward a coffeehouse that will change the world in ways that no one inside it could possibly predict. Lloyd's Coffeehouse sits on Lombard Street, close enough to the Thames that on foggy mornings you can smell the salt and tar and exotic cargo that pass through the port of London. It is just past 9:30 in the evening and the place is still packed. But the crowd here is different from what we saw at the other coffeehouse. These men smell of the sea. Their faces are weathered, tanned dark by sun and wind. Their hands are rough with rope burns and calluses. Some wear the finer coats of ship owners and merchants, but others are clearly working sailors, men who've spent months at sea and are now home for a brief respite before their next voyage. This is Lloyd's, and if you want to understand how a simple coffeehouse could evolve into one of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth, you need to understand what is happening in this room right now. Edward Lloyd opened his coffeehouse in 1686, and from the very beginning he understood something crucial. Location matters. By situating himself near the docks, he guaranteed a steady stream of customers from the maritime trade. But more than that, he understood what those customers needed. They did not just need coffee, they needed information, and they needed it faster and more accurately than anyone else could provide it. Let me paint you a picture of what maritime commerce looked like in 1750. England was a global empire. Ships sailed to the Americas, to Africa, to India, to the Far East. They carried wool and manufactured goods out, and they brought back sugar, tobacco, cotton, tea, spices, enslaved people. The wealth of nations literally floated on wooden ships across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean. And every ship that left port represented an enormous financial risk. Think about it from the perspective of a merchant. You've invested everything you own into a cargo of wool being shipped to the American colonies. The ship will be at sea for 6 to 8 weeks each way. During that time, 1,000 things could go wrong. Storms could sink the ship, pirates could capture it, the crew could mutiny, the cargo could spoil, a war could break out and enemy navies could seize your vessel. And you, sitting in London, would have no way of knowing what happened until months later, when the ship either returned safely or failed to return at all. This uncertainty created a market for insurance. Ship owners and merchants needed a way to spread the risk. And that is where the underwriters came in. An underwriter was a person, usually a wealthy individual, who would agree to compensate you if your ship was lost, in exchange for a fee paid up front. The term underwriter comes from the practice of literally writing your name under the terms of the insurance contract, signifying your agreement to bear the risk. But how did an underwriter decide what fee to charge? How did they assess the risk? They needed information. They needed to know which routes were dangerous and which were safe. They needed to know which captains were skilled and which were reckless. They needed to know about weather patterns, pirate activity, political instability in foreign ports. They needed, in short, exactly the kind of information that flowed through Lloyd's Coffeehouse. Edward Lloyd was a genius at gathering and organising this information. He started simply by encouraging ship captains to stop by his coffee house when they returned to port. He would buy them a cup of coffee and chat with them about their voyage. Where did they sail? What conditions did they encounter? Did they see any suspicious vessels? Were there any problems at foreign ports? Lloyd would take notes, then he would share this information with the underwriters who gathered at his establishment. But Lloyd did not stop there. In 1696 he began publishing Lloyd's List, a simple sheet of paper that listed ship movements, when ships arrived, when they departed, and any news about vessels that had been lost or damaged. This newsletter was distributed only to patrons of Lloyd's Coffee House. If you wanted access to the best maritime intelligence in London, you had to come to Lloyd's and buy your coffee there. The brilliance of this system cannot be overstated. Lloyd had created what economists now call an information asymmetry advantage. The underwriters at Lloyd's knew things that underwriters elsewhere did not know. This allowed them to make better decisions. They could charge lower premiums on safe voyages because they knew those voyages were safe. They could refuse to insure risky ventures that other underwriters might accept out of ignorance. Over time, this meant that Lloyd's underwriters made more profit and suffered fewer losses than their competitors. Success bred more success. More underwriters came to Lloyd's. More merchants came looking for insurance, and Lloyd's Coffee House became the centre of the maritime insurance industry. But let us step into the room and see how this actually worked in practice. Because the process of negotiating insurance was fascinatingly informal. There were no desks, no offices, no formal structure whatsoever, just men sitting at wooden tables, drinking coffee, and making deals that could involve thousands of pounds. Over there, near the fireplace, you see a ship captain in conversation with three well-dressed gentlemen. The captain is describing his planned voyage to Jamaica. He will carry manufactured goods from England, sell them in Kingston, load up with sugar and rum, and return. The round trip should take about 4 months. He is looking for underwriters who will insure his ship and cargo for the journey. The three gentlemen are underwriters. They listen carefully, asking questions. What is the condition of the ship? How experienced is the crew? What time of year will the voyage take place? The captain answers each question, knowing that his responses will determine whether these men agree to insure him and at what price. Eventually, after much discussion, they reach an agreement. Each underwriter will take a portion of the risk. One agrees to cover 1/3 of the total value, another takes another third, and the third takes the remaining portion. If the ship is lost, they each pay their share. If the ship returns safely, they each keep their premium as profit. The deal is sealed with handshakes and the scratching of quill pens on paper. This system, informal as it seems, was remarkably effective, and it contained within it the seeds of something profound. It was a system for pooling risk across multiple investors. No single underwriter had to bear the full weight of a potential loss. This meant that more ventures could be insured, more ships could sail, more trade could happen. It was a mechanism for enabling risk-taking, and therefore for enabling economic growth. But there was something else happening at Lloyd's, something darker that we need to acknowledge. Because while ships carried wool and sugar, they also carried human beings, enslaved Africans stolen from their homes and transported in horrific conditions to the Americas. And the insurance industry that developed at Lloyd's covered those ships too. Underwriters at Lloyd's Coffee House, sitting in their comfortable surroundings, sipping their coffee, made profits by insuring the vessels that carried enslaved people across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, that nightmare journey that killed millions, was made financially viable in part because of the risk-spreading mechanisms developed at this very establishment. This is the paradox we keep encountering. The coffee houses were engines of progress, of innovation, of intellectual and economic advancement. But they were also deeply embedded in systems of exploitation and oppression. The slave trade, the colonial system, the extraction of wealth from conquered peoples, all of this was facilitated, organised and profited from by men sitting in London coffee houses, men who probably never even thought about the human cost of what they were doing. To them, it was just business, just numbers on a ledger, just risk and reward. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to romanticize the past, to see these coffee houses as purely noble institutions. But the truth is always more complicated. The same institutions that spread Enlightenment ideas also spread the reach of empire. The same mechanisms that allowed for scientific progress also allowed for industrialized cruelty. History is not clean. It is messy and contradictory and morally ambiguous. And if we want to understand it honestly, we have to hold all of these truths at once. But let us return to Lloyd's in 1750, to the mechanics of how this place functioned. Because beyond the insurance deals, there was another layer of activity, information trading. Men would come to Lloyd's not to insure a voyage, but simply to learn what was happening in the maritime world. Has anyone heard from the ship that sailed for Bombay 3 months ago? Is there news of French privateers in the Caribbean? What are sugar prices like in Jamaica right now? This information had value. If you knew that a hurricane had destroyed half the sugar crop in the West Indies before anyone else knew, you could buy up sugar futures in London before prices rose. If you knew that a particular trade route had become dangerous, you could short the stocks of companies operating on that route. Information was not just useful for making decisions, it was a commodity in itself, something that could be bought and sold. And Lloyd's Coffee House was the marketplace. Men would trade tips, rumours, confirmed reports. Some of this information was freely given, part of the communal atmosphere of the coffee house. But some of it was sold. A captain might accept a few coins to share details of what he saw on his last voyage. A clerk at the East India Company might be paid to leak information about upcoming shipments. Not all of this was legal or ethical, but it happened nonetheless. Edward Lloyd himself stayed carefully neutral. He was not an underwriter. He did not trade in information for profit. He simply provided the space and the coffee in his newsletter. His profit came from the volume of customers, not from participating in their deals. This neutrality was crucial to his success. Everyone trusted that Lloyd's was a fair venue, that the information provided in Lloyd's list was as accurate as humanly possible. And that trust made Lloyd's the place to be. Over the decades, Lloyd's Coffee House became more than just a coffee house. It became an institution. When Edward Lloyd died in 1713, the business continued under new management. The underwriters who gathered there began to organise themselves more formally. They created systems for verifying information, for standardising insurance contracts, for settling disputes. By the 1760s, Lloyd's had moved to the Royal Exchange Building and was operating as a semi-formal insurance market. By 1771, a group of underwriters formed the Society of Lloyd's, which evolved into Lloyd's of London as we know it today. And here is the remarkable thing. Lloyd's of London is still operating. Right now, as you listen to this, Lloyd's is one of the largest insurance and reinsurance markets in the world. It insures everything from oil tankers to satellites to celebrity body parts. It has survived wars, financial crashes, catastrophic losses. And it all started in a coffee house on Lombard Street, with Edward Lloyd serving coffee to sailors and taking notes about their voyages. But Lloyd's was not the only coffee house where major British institutions were born. Let me tell you about another one, just a short walk away. Garraway's Coffee House, located in Change Alley near Jonathan's, was known for something quite different. Auctions, Garraway's became famous for its auction by the candle method. Here is how it worked. An item would be put up for bid. A small candle would be lit. Bidders would call out their offers, and when the candle burned down and the flame went out, whoever had made the last bid before the candle died would win the auction. It was dramatic, it was exciting, and it created intense pressure as the candle burned lower and lower, with bidders shouting frantically to get their offers in before time ran out. Garraway's held auctions for all sorts of things: tea, fur, tobacco, land, and sometimes, horrifyingly, human beings. There is a documented auction listing from 1773 where 128 enslaved people were sold at Garraway's Coffeehouse alongside a plantation in Tobago. 128 human lives auctioned off like livestock in a coffeehouse. While other patrons sat nearby drinking coffee and reading newspapers, a slave auction was taking place. The cognitive dissonance is almost impossible to process, but it happened. It was legal. It was normal. This is what I mean when I say we have to hold contradictory truths. The coffee houses were spaces of enlightenment, yes, but they were also spaces where the machinery of empire and exploitation operated smoothly. The men who frequented these places saw no contradiction. They could discuss philosophy and human rights over coffee in the morning and then participate in a slave auction in the afternoon. The moral blind spots were enormous, but I do not want to end this part of our journey only on darkness, because there is something powerful in the Lloyd story that we should not lose sight of. Lloyd succeeded because it created trust. In a world of uncertainty and risk, Lloyd's provided reliable information. It created a space where deals could be made with confidence. And that trust, that reliability, was valuable enough that it survived for centuries. Trust is the foundation of all commerce. Without trust, trade collapses. Lloyd's understood this. Edward Lloyd understood this. And by creating a system where information was gathered carefully, shared freely among patrons, and protected from manipulation, he built something that lasted far beyond his own lifetime. That is a lesson worth remembering. Institutions endure not because of the individuals who create them, but because of the trust they build. As you sit in Lloyd's coffee house watching underwriters negotiate deals, watching captains share tales of the sea, watching clerks scribble notes about ship movements, you feel the weight of history pressing down. This room is a hinge point. What happens here ripples outward across oceans, affects lives on distant continents, shapes the economic and political future of nations. And everyone here knows it. You can see it in the intensity of the conversations, in the careful way men choose their words, in the seriousness with which even casual information is treated. The clock on the wall shows 10:15. Outside, the streets of London are beginning to quiet, but the coffee houses remain lit, still buzzing with activity. There are still hours to go before the night truly ends. And there is so much more to see, so many more stories to uncover. Because while Lloyd's and Garraway's represent the commercial side of coffeehouse culture, there is another side entirely, the literary side. The world of poets and playwrights and essayists who transformed the English language in these very rooms. And in the next part of our journey, we are going to visit the coffee houses where words were weaponized, where literary reputations were made and destroyed, where some of the greatest writers in English history gathered to argue about metaphors and metre. We are going to step into the world of Will's Coffee House and Button's Coffee House, where the art of conversation reached its highest form, and where the line between friendly debate and bitter rivalry could be crossed with a single careless phrase. Now we turn away from the river, away from the smell of salt and tar, and make our way west toward Covent Garden. The character of the streets changes as we walk. The buildings become taller, more elegant, the shops are more refined. We pass theatres with their doors still open, spilling golden light and the sound of laughter onto the cobblestones. This is the entertainment district, the world of actors and playwrights and people who make their living from words. And it is here on Russell Street that we find a very different kind of coffeehouse. One where the currency is not ships or stocks or insurance contracts, but something far more dangerous. Reputation. Will's Coffee House sits on the corner of Russell Street and Bow Street, and even from outside you can tell this is a special place. The crowd gathered near the entrance is younger, more fashionably dressed. The conversations you overhear as you approach are not about trade or politics, but about the latest play at Drury Lane, about a new volume of poetry, about whether Paradise Lost is truly the masterpiece everyone claims or merely an overrated relic. These are the wits, the literary men, the people who care desperately about the precise placement of a comma or the choice between two nearly identical words. We step inside and immediately you notice the difference. Will's is more refined than the coffee houses we have visited so far. The furniture is better maintained. The paintings on the walls show classical scenes, gods and heroes from Greek mythology, and there, in the seat of honour by the window, sits the most famous literary figure in England, John Dryden. Dryden is in his 60s now. In 1750 we are imagining a time when his legend still echoes, though Dryden himself died in 1700. But let me take you back to when he ruled this place, because his presence defined Will's Coffee House for decades. Every afternoon, Dryden would arrive and take his seat by the window. It was his seat. Everyone knew it. No one else would dare sit there. And from that chair, Dryden would hold court. Young poets and playwrights would gather around him, hoping for his approval, terrified of his criticism. A kind word from Dryden could launch a career. A dismissive comment could destroy one. This was the power of the literary coffee houses. They created hierarchies, reputations, careers, and they did it through conversation, through the art of wit and verbal combat that the English prized above almost everything else. To be considered witty in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was to possess the most valuable social currency imaginable. Wit meant intelligence, yes, but it also meant the ability to express that intelligence in clever, amusing, cutting ways. It meant being able to improvise brilliant responses, to turn phrases that would be quoted and repeated, to demolish your opponents with words so sharp they drew blood. And Will's Coffee House was the arena where this combat took place. Listen to the conversation at the table nearest to Dryden's window seat. 3 young men are arguing about heroic couplets. One of them believes that Alexander Pope has perfected the form, that his translation of Homer's Iliad represents the pinnacle of English poetry. Another insists that Pope is merely clever, that his verses have polish but lack genuine feeling. The third is trying to stake out a middle position, arguing that technique and emotion are not opposites but complementary aspects of great art. This might sound like an obscure academic debate, the kind of thing that only literature professors would care about. But in the coffee houses of Covent Garden, these debates mattered intensely, because in this world, your literary taste defined you. The way you spoke about poetry, the positions you took on matters of style and form, these things marked you as either a person of discernment or a fool. And being marked as a fool in front of Dryden or one of the other literary giants could be socially devastating. The stakes were high because these coffee houses were where literary careers were made. Publishers frequented these places, looking for new talent. Theatre managers came to hear about promising playwrights. Wealthy patrons who wanted to be known as supporters of the arts would show up, hoping to discover the next great poet and sponsor their work. If you could impress the right people at Will's or Button's, you might find yourself with a published volume of poetry, a play being staged at one of the major theatres, or a comfortable position as a tutor or secretary to a wealthy family. But if you embarrassed yourself, if you revealed ignorance or poor judgment or lack of wit, you might find yourself blacklisted. Your work would not be read. Your manuscripts would not be published. Your reputation would be ruined before your career even began. The literary coffeehouses were simultaneously places of opportunity and places of danger. Alexander Pope understood this better than almost anyone. Pope was a brilliant poet, but also a brilliant manipulator of the literary marketplace. He knew that reputation was everything, and he used the coffeehouses strategically to build his own reputation while destroying his enemies. Pope was small in stature, barely 4.5 feet tall due to a childhood illness that left him with a curved spine. He suffered from constant pain and illness throughout his life, but his mind was sharp as a blade, and his wit was legendary. Pope frequented the coffeehouses and made himself indispensable to the literary conversation. He cultivated relationships with influential figures. He flattered the right people, and when someone crossed him, he took revenge through his poetry. His poem The Dunciad is essentially a massive literary assault on everyone Pope considered his inferior, which was almost everyone. He mocked bad poets, corrupt publishers, foolish critics, and he did it with such brilliant style that the poem became hugely popular. People quoted lines from the Dunciad in coffeehouses, laughing at Pope's victims. To be mentioned in the Dunciad was to be humiliated publicly and permanently. This was the dark side of the literary coffeehouses. They could be vicious. Friendships could shatter over a difference of opinion about a play. Rival factions would form, Whigs versus Tories in politics, but also competing literary schools with different ideas about what made good art. And the weapons in these wars were words, satire, mockery, devastating reviews. Let me tell you about the pamphlet wars. In the early 18th century, before newspapers had extensive literary coverage, writers would publish their opinions in pamphlets. These were short, cheaply printed documents, usually just a few pages, that could be produced quickly and distributed widely. And the coffee houses were where these pamphlets circulated. Someone would publish a pamphlet praising a new play. A rival would immediately publish a pamphlet attacking it. The original author would fire back with another pamphlet. The attacks would become more personal, more vicious. Accusations of plagiarism, incompetence, moral degeneracy, all aired in public for anyone to read. These pamphlet wars were eagerly followed by coffeehouse patrons. New pamphlets would arrive, and people would read them aloud, analysing every line, laughing at the clever insults, gasping at the bold accusations. It was entertainment, but it was also serious business. Reputations hung in the balance, and the coffee houses were the courtroom where public opinion was decided. Now, not far from Will's, there was another literary coffee house that we need to visit. Button's Coffee House opened by Daniel Button around 1712. Button had been a servant to Joseph Addison, one of the most influential essayists and playwrights of the era, and Button's became famous for one particular feature, the lion's head. This was a large wooden letterbox carved in the shape of a lion's head and painted gold. It was mounted on the wall of the coffee house and its mouth was open. The lion's head served as a mailbox for The Guardian, a periodical edited by Addison. Readers could drop letters, essays, poems, whatever they wanted to submit into the lion's mouth. Addison would collect these submissions and occasionally publish them in The Guardian. This might sound quaint, but it was actually revolutionary. For the first time, ordinary people could participate directly in literary culture. You did not need to know the right people or have access to publishers. You could just write something, drop it into the lion's head, and potentially see your words in print. It was democratic. It was participatory. It was the 18th century equivalent of publishing a blog post or a tweet. And it created a community. People would gather at Buttons specifically to discuss what had appeared in The Guardian that week. They would speculate about who had written the anonymous submissions. They would debate the merits of different pieces. The coffee house became a kind of living editorial board, where the quality of writing was constantly evaluated and discussed. But Buttons and Wills were also rivals. Bitter rivals. John Dryden had been the king of Wills, but after his death in 1700, the mantle passed to different figures. Meanwhile, Buttons attracted a younger, more contemporary crowd. They saw themselves as the future of English literature, while they dismissed the patrons of Wills as old-fashioned and out of touch. The Wills crowd, in turn, saw the Buttons crowd as upstarts with more ambition than talent. This rivalry played out in countless small ways. A poet who published something that pleased the Buttons crowd might be mocked at Wills. A play that succeeded with the Wills audience might be savaged by critics who frequented Buttons. The coffee houses became tribal, and loyalty to your chosen establishment was a statement about your literary values. Do you see the parallel to today? How different online communities develop their own values, their own standards, their own rivalries. How being part of one group can make you hostile to another. The dynamics have not changed. Only the technology has changed. There is a wonderful account from this period by Richard Steele, who co-founded The Spectator with Addison. Steele describes visiting various coffee houses to gauge reaction to a new play. He would listen carefully to what people said, noting which arguments seemed to resonate and which fell flat. He was, in essence, conducting market research, using the coffee houses as a focus group to understand public taste. And then he would write essays in The Spectator that either supported or attacked the play based on what he had learned. This is significant because it shows how the coffee houses and the emerging print culture work together. Newspapers and periodicals like The Spectator and The Guardian were written for coffee house audiences. They assumed readers had access to the same conversations, the same debates, the same gossip that circulated in these spaces, and in turn, what appeared in print would fuel more coffeehouse discussion. It was a feedback loop. Print culture and coffeehouse culture were inseparable. The essays published in The Spectator and The Guardian are fascinating documents. They covered everything from serious moral philosophy to fashion advice to theatrical criticism to satirical character sketches, and they were written in a conversational style, as if the author was sitting across from you in a coffee house, sharing observations about life in London. This style was deliberately chosen to mirror the coffee house experience. The essays were meant to feel like good conversation. Addison and Steele explicitly stated that their goal was to bring philosophy out of the universities and into the coffee houses. They wanted to make ideas accessible, to present serious moral and philosophical questions in a way that ordinary people could engage with. And it worked. The Spectator became enormously popular. People would rush to coffee houses to read the latest issue. They would discuss it over a coffee. They would write responses that would be dropped into the Lion's Head at Buttons. It was interactive literature, and it only worked because the coffee houses provided the infrastructure for that interaction. But the literary coffee houses were not just about high-minded intellectual discourse. They were also about gossip, about scandals, about who was sleeping with whom, who was in debt, who had insulted whom at a party. The line between literary criticism and personal attack was often very thin. A negative review might be motivated not by genuine artistic disagreement, but by personal grudges, political differences, or simple jealousy, and the gossip could be vicious. There are accounts of poets being driven to despair by the mockery they faced in coffee houses, of playwrights whose careers were destroyed by a coordinated campaign of negative pamphlets, of suicides attributed to the cruelty of coffeehouse culture. The literary world was not kind. It was competitive, cutthroat, and often deeply personal. Yet despite the cruelty, or perhaps because of it, The literary coffeehouses produced some of the greatest writers in the English language. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels and one of the most brilliant satirists who ever lived, was a regular at these coffeehouses. Samuel Johnson, whose dictionary defined English for generations, held court at coffeehouses later in the century. Alexander Pope, despite his physical limitations and constant health problems, dominated the literary scene through sheer force of intellect and wit, much of it honed in coffeehouse debates. These men were not born great writers. They became great writers partly because the coffeehouses forced them to sharpen their skills. Every day they had to defend their ideas in front of critical audiences. They had to learn to think quickly, to argue persuasively, to express complex thoughts in clear and memorable ways. The coffeehouses were training grounds. They made writers better by making them compete, and competition breeds innovation. The reason English literature flourished so dramatically in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was partly because of this intense competitive pressure. Writers had to constantly innovate to stand out. New forms, new styles, new subjects. The essay as we know it today was essentially invented in the coffeehouses. The novel was emerging as a literary form, and coffeehouses played a role in that development too. The serial publication of stories, with cliffhangers and ongoing plots, was partly a response to the way coffeehouse audiences consumed literature. They wanted something new every week, something to discuss and debate. As you sit in Will's coffeehouse watching young poets nervously approach Dryden's window seat, watching pamphlets circulate from table to table, listening to arguments that might seem trivial but carry enormous weight for the participants, you start to understand something about human nature. We need spaces where our ideas are tested, where we are challenged, where success is not guaranteed and failure is very public. These spaces are uncomfortable, they are stressful, but they are also where greatness is forged. The clock shows 11. The night is more than half over, and yet the coffeehouses show no signs of emptying. If anything, they seem more crowded now, more energetic. There is something about the late hour that loosens tongues, that makes conversations more honest, more daring, and we've only seen a fraction of what these places contain. Because not all coffeehouses were respectable establishments dedicated to commerce or literature or science. Some were darker places, places where criminals gathered, where prostitutes worked, where the rules of polite society were openly flouted. And in the next part of our journey, we are going to venture into those shadows. We are going to visit the coffee houses that polite society whispered about. Places like Molking's Coffee House in Covent Garden, where the clientele included thieves, pimps, and people on the absolute margins of 18th century London. Because to understand the coffee houses completely, we need to see all of them, the noble and the sordid, the enlightened and the desperate, the places where the dream of equality became something strange and dangerous. The same streets that house elegant literary coffee houses also shelter places that polite society pretends not to see. We are still in Covent Garden, but we are moving toward the shadows now, toward the corners where the lamplight does not quite reach. It is past 11, approaching midnight, and this is when the other London emerges, the London of pickpockets and prostitutes, of gamblers and confidence men, of people who survive by their wits in ways that would never be discussed at Will's or Button's. There, on the corner where the market square meets a narrow alley, you see a coffee house with no name on its sign, just a painted image of a crude crown. This is Molking's Coffee House, and if you have any sense of self-preservation, you would walk past it quickly and pretend you never saw it. But we are not here to be sensible. We are here to understand the complete picture of coffeehouse culture, and that means venturing into places that respectable historians often gloss over or ignore entirely. Molking's is run by a woman, which is unusual but not unheard of. What makes it notorious is who that woman is and who she welcomes through her door. Moll King, whose real name is Mary King, is a former prostitute who managed to accumulate enough money to buy her own establishment, and she has turned it into a refuge for the people she knew from her previous life. The clientele here is what 18th century Londoners would call the criminal classes, but that phrase hides more than it reveals, because who exactly is criminal depends very much on where you stand. Let us step inside. Immediately you notice the difference. The air is thicker here, hotter. The tobacco smoke is so dense it makes your eyes water. The smell is earthier, ranker. Sweat and cheap perfume and spilled alcohol. Yes, alcohol. Because unlike the respectable coffee houses that pride themselves on sobriety, Moll King's serves gin and brandy alongside coffee. The furniture is rougher, scarred with knife marks and stains. And the people, oh, the people. At a table near the door sit 3 men in worn coats playing cards. But they are not playing for pennies. There are gold coins on the table. More money than a working man might see in a year. These are professional gamblers, men who make their living by calculating odds and reading the tells of other players. One of them glances up as you enter, assesses you with cold eyes, and then dismisses you as not worth his time. You're not rich enough to be a worthwhile target. In the corner, a woman with painted cheeks and a low-cut dress laughs too loudly at something a well-dressed gentleman has said. He is clearly not from this neighbourhood. His coat is too fine, his wig too powdered. He is slumming, seeking the thrill of danger without real risk. And she is working, playing a role, calculating how much money she can extract from him before the night is over. This is the economy of Covent Garden after dark. Services rendered for coin and everyone understands the transaction. But look past the obvious. Because Moll King's is more complex than it first appears. Yes, it is a place where prostitutes meet clients. Yes, it is where criminals gather to plan their next scheme. But it is also a place where people on the absolute margins of society find community, where a woman fleeing an abusive husband might find shelter for a night, where a young man who has lost everything to gambling debt might find someone willing to offer work, even if that work is not exactly legal, where people who have been rejected by respectable society can exist without constant judgment. This is the paradox of places like Moll King's. They are predatory, they are dangerous, but they are also necessary, because 18th century London had no social safety net, no welfare system, no homeless shelters or food banks. If you fell through the cracks of respectable society, places like Moll King's were where you landed. And while they might exploit you, they would also keep you alive. The historian Helen Berry has written extensively about Moll King's Coffeehouse, and she makes a fascinating argument. She points out that Moll King's attracted an unusually wide social mix. Yes, there were criminals and prostitutes, but there were also Covent Garden market traders, men who sold vegetables and fruit at the nearby market. There were actors from the theatres, people whose profession placed them in a morally ambiguous position in society. There were minor aristocrats looking for excitement, and there were people you might call working poor, servants and labourers who could not afford the more respectable coffee houses, but still wanted a place to gather. In other words, Moll King's was doing what all coffee houses claim to do but rarely achieved. It was genuinely bringing together people from different social classes. The difference was that at Moll King's no one pretended to be equal. The hierarchies were acknowledged. The transactions were explicit. A pickpocket knew he was a pickpocket. A prostitute knew she was a prostitute. There was no hypocrisy, no pretense. And in a strange way, that honesty was refreshing. But let us not romanticize this place too much, because Moll King's was also where violent crimes were planned, where stolen goods were sold, where vulnerable people were taken advantage of. There are court records documenting cases that originated at Moll King's. A young man lured into a rigged card game and robbed. A woman drugged and assaulted. A merchant beaten and his money stolen. These things happened, and Mole King herself, while she might have provided a refuge for some, was complicit in the darker activities that took place under her roof. This raises an uncomfortable question. What is the line between survival and exploitation? Mole King was a survivor. She had climbed out of prostitution and created a business. She employed people, provided a space, contributed to the local economy. But she also profited from illegal activities, from the desperation of others, from systems of exploitation. Is she a villain or a victim who became a survivor by any means necessary? History does not give us easy answers. Now, Mole King's was not the only disreputable coffeehouse in London. There were many others, each with its own character and clientele. Some catered specifically to thieves with coded language for discussing stolen goods. If you knew the right words, you could arrange to sell a pocket watch or a piece of silver jewellery, no questions asked. These coffeehouses functioned as early versions of pawn shops, except without any legal oversight. Other coffeehouses were known as meeting places for political conspirators. Remember, England in the 18th century was politically unstable. There were still Jacobites who wanted to restore the Stuart line to the throne. There were Republicans who wanted to abolish the monarchy entirely. These people could not meet openly. They needed places where they could speak freely without attracting the attention of government informers. And certain coffee houses, ones run by sympathetic owners, provided that space. The problem, of course, was that these places were also infiltrated by informers. The government paid well for information about potential plots, and coffeehouse owners, even sympathetic ones, could be pressured or bribed. The result was a constant cat-and-mouse game. Conspirators would meet speaking carefully, using code words, never fully trusting anyone, and sometimes they were caught. The assassination plot against King William III that we mentioned earlier, the one discovered in 1696 at Jonathan's Coffee House, was exposed partly through informers who had infiltrated coffeehouse discussions. This atmosphere of suspicion affected all coffee houses, not just the criminal ones. Even at respectable establishments, patrons had to be careful what they said. You never knew who was listening. A casual criticism of the government might be reported. A joke about the king might be interpreted as sedition. The coffeehouses promised free speech, but that freedom was always conditional, always under surveillance. Let me tell you about a specific incident that illustrates the danger. In 1749, a man named Dr. Archibald Cameron was arrested for his involvement in the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Part of the evidence against him came from conversations he had in London coffeehouses, conversations that were overheard and reported by government spies. Cameron was tried, convicted, and executed. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the brutal punishment reserved for traitors. And his crime, in part, was talking too freely in coffeehouses. This is the shadow side of coffeehouse culture. The surveillance, the informers, the knowledge that any conversation might be your last free one if you said the wrong thing to the wrong person. It created paranoia. It stifled some kinds of speech while allowing others. And it meant that the coffeehouses, for all their promise of open discourse, were never truly free spaces. But beyond politics, there was gambling. Oh, the gambling. Coffeehouses were not legally allowed to operate as gambling houses, but that did not stop them. Cards, dice, and more elaborate games of chance were common. Some men lost fortunes. There are records of estates gambled away, inheritances destroyed, families ruined, all because of card games played in coffeehouses, and the gambling was not always fair. Marked cards, loaded dice, Confederates working together to cheat unsuspecting victims, professional gamblers operated in teams, with elaborate systems for communicating secretly during games. They would target wealthy young men, flatter them, encourage them to drink, and then systematically relieve them of their money. By the time the victim realized what had happened, the gamblers had moved on to a different coffee house, a different neighborhood, a different victim. The government occasionally tried to crack down on coffeehouse gambling, but enforcement was spotty. Coffeehouse owners would pay bribes to local officials, raids would be announced in advance, giving gamblers time to hide the evidence. And even when someone was caught and fined, the fines were small enough that they were just considered a cost of doing business. There is a satirical print from 1721 titled The South Sea Bubble, which shows the chaos in the coffeehouses during the financial collapse we discussed earlier. And in the background of that print, you can see men gambling, fighting, drinking themselves into oblivion. The artist was making a point. The same reckless, desperate energy that drove people to gamble on worthless stocks also drove them to gamble on cards. It was all the same impulse, the hope of easy money, the thrill of risk, the delusion that somehow this time fortune would favour you. But here is something interesting. Not all the crime in coffeehouses was about theft or violence. Some of it was about information. We talked earlier about how information was currency in the coffeehouses. Well, that meant information could be stolen or sold. There are documented cases of clerks who worked for government offices or trading companies, men who had access to sensitive information, selling that information to interested parties in coffeehouses. Details about upcoming legislation, news about military movements before it became public, advanced knowledge of price changes in commodities. This was insider trading before the term existed, and it was not technically illegal because the laws had not caught up with the reality of how information markets worked. So men could make fortunes by having knowledge a few hours or days before everyone else. And the coffee houses, with their culture of information exchange, were the perfect venues for these transactions. You could pass a document under a table, receive payment in cash and walk away. No written records, no way to prove what had happened. Think about what this means. The same coffee houses that hosted scientific lectures and literary debates also hosted criminal conspiracies. The same spaces that claimed to value truth and reason also facilitated deception and fraud. The coffee houses contained multitudes. They were not one thing, they were everything, all mixed together in a chaotic, vibrant, sometimes terrifying whole. As you sit in Mulking's coffee house watching the gamblers play their hands, watching the prostitutes work the room, watching the stolen goods change hands in corners, you feel the moral complexity of this world pressing in. It is easy to judge, to condemn, to say these people are criminals and should be punished. But what if you were born into poverty with no prospects? What if your only marketable skill was picking pockets? What if selling your body was the only way to feed your children? The coffee houses did not create these problems, they just made them visible. And there is something almost honest about that visibility. In the respectable coffee houses, everyone pretended to be equal, but the inequality was just hidden beneath a veneer of civility. Here at Mulking's, the inequality is naked and obvious. No one pretends, no one lies about who they are or what they are doing. There is a brutal honesty to survival. The clock shows midnight. We have been in the coffee houses for 6 hours now, and we have seen so much: intellectual debate and financial mania, literary warfare and criminal enterprise, Enlightenment ideals and brutal exploitation. The coffee houses are a mirror of human nature in all its complexity, and we are not done yet. Because there is one more aspect of coffeehouse culture that we need to address, the most glaring exclusion. The elephant in the room, or rather, the half of humanity locked outside the room. We need to talk about women. about why they were excluded from these spaces, about the arguments made to justify that exclusion, and about the ways some women resisted and carved out their own place in coffeehouse culture despite every obstacle. That is where we turn next. To the battle of the sexes in 18th century London, fought not with weapons but with pamphlets, petitions, and the slow, stubborn refusal of women to accept their exclusion from public intellectual life. Imagine for a moment that you are a woman in 1750 London. You're intelligent, educated, curious about the world. You've read books, perhaps even learned Latin or French from a private tutor if your family could afford it. You understand politics. You have opinions about literature, about science, about philosophy. And every day you watch the men in your life, your husband, your father, your brothers, leave the house and disappear into coffee houses for hours. They come home animated, full of news and ideas and debates. They have been to the penny universities. They have participated in the great intellectual conversations of the age. And you, no matter how brilliant you might be, are locked out. The door is closed to you, not by law exactly, but by something more powerful than law, by custom, by propriety, by the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules about what respectable women can and cannot do. This is the reality we need to confront. Everything we have explored tonight, all the intellectual excitement and democratic possibility of the coffee houses, was available only to half the population, and the other half, the women, were expected to accept their exclusion without complaint. But did they? That is the question. And the answer is more complicated and more fascinating than you might expect. Let us start with the most famous document about women and coffee houses, the Women's Petition Against Coffee, published in 1674. If you have heard anything about women and coffeehouse culture, you have probably heard about this petition. It claims to represent the women of London, and it absolutely savages coffee and the coffee houses. The language is extraordinary. The petition calls coffee a newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor. But it does not stop at criticising the beverage. It goes after the men who drink it, claiming that excessive coffee consumption has made Englishmen effeminate, weak, and unable to fulfil their duties as husbands. The language gets quite explicit. The petition complains that men now spend all their time talking instead of doing anything useful, that they have become nothing worth, being mere eunuchs due to their coffee habit. On the surface, this looks like evidence of genuine conflict between women and coffeehouse culture. The women are angry. Their husbands are spending all day in coffee houses, spending money, engaging in this strange obsessive behaviour. And meanwhile, the women are stuck at home, excluded from the conversations, kept in the dark about what is happening in the wider world. It makes sense that they would be frustrated. But here is where it gets interesting. Modern historians do not think the women's petition against coffee was actually written by women. The evidence suggests it was written by men, possibly tavern owners who were losing business to the coffee houses, or possibly by religious authorities who saw the coffee houses as dens of sedition and wanted to undermine them. The petition was satire. It was propaganda. And it worked by pretending to give voice to women's concerns while actually mocking those concerns. This is important because it reveals something about how women's voices were manipulated in this period. Real women's complaints about their exclusion from coffee houses could not be taken seriously, but a satirical pamphlet pretending to be from women, complaining that their husbands were not virile enough, that was acceptable. That could be published and widely circulated. The actual problem, which was women's exclusion from public intellectual life, was ignored. But a fake problem, framed in sexual terms and played for laughs, became part of the public discourse. So what did real women think about the coffee houses? We have some evidence, though it is fragmentary. There are letters and diaries from educated women expressing frustration about being shut out of the conversations. There are accounts of women standing outside coffee houses, trying to listen through windows or doors. There are stories, probably exaggerated but perhaps containing some truth, of women dressing as men to sneak into coffee houses. And then there are the women who manage to participate in coffeehouse culture despite the barriers. Let me tell you about a few of them. Anne Rochford was a coffeehouse owner in the late 17th century. She inherited the business from her husband and ran it successfully for years. Contemporary accounts describe her as sharp, witty, and perfectly capable of holding her own in the male-dominated world of coffeehouse commerce. She was respected, even admired, but she was also the subject of satire and gossip. Satirical prints showed her as domineering, mannish, unnatural. The message was clear. A woman could run a coffee house, but she would be mocked for it. Then there was Moll King, whom we met in the previous section. Whatever you think of her morally, she was a woman who carved out power in a world that tried to deny her any. She turned her coffee house into a business that lasted for decades. She employed people. She created a space where the rules of respectable society did not apply. And yes, she profited from exploitation and vice, but she also survived in a world that gave women very few options for survival. But ownership was not the only way women participated in coffeehouse culture. Some worked as servers, as the women who actually prepared and served the coffee. These women were visible in the coffee houses every day, but they were not supposed to participate in the conversations. They were supposed to be invisible, functionally. Serve the coffee, clear the cups, and fade into the background. But invisibility can be a kind of power. If you are invisible, people forget you are listening. They say things in front of you that they would never say if they thought you were paying attention. There are hints in the historical record that some of these women gathered information, that they knew things, that they played roles in the information networks that ran through the coffee houses. A server who heard a piece of valuable news might sell that information. A woman who overheard a conspiracy might report it to the authorities, or use it for her own purposes. We cannot know for certain how often this happened, because the historical record is the activities of women who were considered insignificant. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And then there were the salon hostesses, because while women could not go to coffee houses, they could host salons in their own homes, and the salons in some ways were the female equivalent of coffee houses. Wealthy, educated women would open their homes for regular gatherings where intellectuals, artists, and political figures would meet to discuss ideas. The salon culture was particularly strong in France, but it existed in England too. Women like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, Elizabeth Montagu, and later in the century Hester Thrale created spaces where serious intellectual conversation could happen, and where they, as hostesses, could participate on equal terms with the men who attended. The salons were different from coffee houses in important ways. They were private rather than public. They were by invitation only, not open to anyone with a penny. They were more refined, more controlled, but they served a similar function. They created space for ideas to circulate, for debates to happen, for intellectual community to form. And they were spaces where women could have influence and authority. But the existence of salons does not solve the problem, because salons were only available to wealthy women. A woman like Anne Rochford might own a coffee house, but she could not attend one as a patron. A woman from the middle or working classes had no access to either coffee houses or salons. Her education, such as it was, came from whatever book she could borrow, whatever she could overhear, whatever scraps of knowledge came her way by accident. The penny universities were closed to her, and there was no equivalent institution that opened its doors. This exclusion had real consequences. It limited women's ability to participate in business. If you could not go to the coffee houses where deals were made and information was exchanged, you were at a severe disadvantage. It limited women's political influence. The coffee houses were where public opinion was formed, where movements began, where the discourse that shaped government policy took place. If you were absent from those conversations, you had no voice. And it limited women's intellectual development. Yes, some women were brilliant despite their lack of access to education, but how many more could have been brilliant if they had been allowed into the penny universities? There is a contemporary account from 1675 by a woman named Hannah Woolley, who wrote a book giving advice to other women. In it, she complained bitterly about women's lack of educational opportunities. She wrote that women were kept in ignorance, that they were taught only domestic skills and considered complete if they could dance and sing and manage a household. She asked why women should not be allowed to learn the same things as men, to develop their minds, to participate in the intellectual life of the nation. Her questions went unanswered. The system did not change. But some women found ways to resist. There is evidence that some women did attend coffee houses despite the social prohibition. Historical accounts mention women being present, usually as the subjects of scandal or satire. There are satirical prints showing women in coffee houses depicted as either prostitutes or as unfeminine, mannish creatures who have violated the natural order. The satire itself is evidence that some women actually did go to coffee houses, because you do not satirize something that never happens. And there were the women writers. Women like Aphra Behn, who was one of the first English women to earn a living by writing. Behn could not attend coffee houses, but she was deeply connected to the literary culture that emerged from them. Her plays were discussed in coffee houses. Her work was reviewed in the periodicals that circulated through coffee houses. She was part of the conversation, even if she could not be physically present in the space where the conversation happened. Later in the century, women like Mary Wollstonecraft would begin to explicitly argue for women's education and women's rights. Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, contains arguments that directly challenge the coffeehouse model of intellectual life. She asked why women should be excluded from rational discourse. She argued that women were capable of the same intellectual achievements as men if given the same opportunities. She pointed out that excluding half the population from education and public life was not just unfair to women, but harmful to society as a whole. Wollstonecraft's arguments did not immediately change anything. Women would not gain full access to public intellectual life for more than a century after she wrote, but the seeds of change were planted, and those seeds grew in part because of the contradiction inherent in the coffeehouse culture. The coffeehouses claimed to value reason, merit, and equality, but they denied those values to women, and that contradiction could not be sustained forever. There is another factor we need to consider. Tea. By the middle of the 18th century, tea was becoming more popular than coffee in England, and tea was associated with women. While men went to coffee houses, women gathered for tea at home or in tea gardens. The rituals around tea drinking created their own social spaces, their own opportunities for conversation and connection. Tea rooms were more respectable than coffee houses, more accessible to women of various social classes. They were not intellectual powerhouses in the way coffee houses were, but they were spaces where women could socialize outside the home. The rise of tea culture created an interesting dynamic. As coffee became associated with male intellectual culture, and tea with female domestic culture, the division between the two beverages reinforced gender divisions. Men drank coffee in coffee houses and talked about important matters. Women drank tea at home and talked about, well, whatever women talked about. The implication was that what women talked about was less important, less serious, not worthy of the same attention. This was nonsense, of course, but it was powerful nonsense that shaped how people thought about gender for generations. Have you ever been excluded from something because of circumstances beyond your control? Because of your gender, your race, your class, your background? Have you ever felt the frustration of knowing you have something to contribute but being denied the opportunity? That is what women in 18th century London experienced every time they saw a coffee house. They were told they were too delicate, too irrational, too domestic for the rough and tumble world of coffee house debate. But the real reason was simpler and uglier. They were excluded because men wanted to keep those spaces for themselves. Because sharing power is hard, and the easiest way to maintain power is to exclude anyone who might challenge it. The coffee house culture eventually declined. By the end of the 18th century, most coffee houses had either closed or transformed into something else. Some became private gentlemen's clubs, which were even more exclusive. Some became public houses serving primarily alcohol. Some simply went out of business as tea replaced coffee as England's beverage of choice. But the legacy of exclusion continued. The institutions that grew out of coffeehouse culture, places like Lloyd's of London, the Stock Exchange, professional associations, remained male-dominated for centuries. Women were excluded from those spaces too. The patterns established in the coffee houses, the idea that serious business and serious intellectual work happened in male spaces, persisted long after the coffee houses themselves were gone. As you sit in the coffee house at midnight, watching the all-male crowd, you feel the absence. The conversations are fascinating, yes. The ideas are stimulating, but they are incomplete. Half of human experience is missing from these discussions. Half of human intelligence is locked outside, and everyone pretends this is normal, natural, the way things should be, but it is not. It is a choice that was made and enforced and justified with elaborate arguments about women's delicate natures and proper roles. And those arguments were always nonsense. They were always just excuses for maintaining power. But the night is not over yet. We have examined the darkness of exclusion, but we need to turn now to political power, because the coffee houses were not just social or intellectual spaces, they were political battlegrounds, and the government knew it. Kings feared them, ministers tried to control them, and at one crucial moment in 1675, the monarchy attempted to shut them down entirely. That confrontation between royal authority and the coffeehouse culture of free speech reveals something fundamental about power, about resistance, and about why these spaces mattered so much that a king felt threatened by them. That is where we go next, to the moment when coffeehouse culture and royal power collided, and to what that collision tells us about freedom, fear, and the price of speaking truth in an age of tyranny. December 29th, 1675. A proclamation is read aloud in coffeehouses across London. Men stop mid-sentence, cups frozen halfway to their lips. The room falls silent, which is remarkable because coffeehouses are never silent. And then someone reads the proclamation again, slowly, making sure everyone understands exactly what the king has just ordered. All coffeehouses in England are to be shut down, closed, forbidden, effective. January 10th, just 12 days away, it will be illegal to operate a coffeehouse. The penalty for defiance is severe. Fines, imprisonment, ruin. Charles II, King of England, has declared war on coffee, but really he has declared war on something much more dangerous than a beverage. He has declared war on the idea that ordinary people have the right to gather and speak freely without royal oversight. And what happens next will determine whether that idea survives. Let us understand what led to this moment. Charles II was not born to be king. His father, Charles I, was executed in 1649 during the English Civil War. Young Charles grew up in exile, watching from abroad as England experimented with being a republic under Oliver Cromwell. He saw his family's power stripped away, saw their supporters hunted down, saw everything that had seemed permanent and unshakable collapse. And when he was finally restored to the throne in 1660, he was haunted by one overwhelming fear: that it could happen again, that another rebellion could rise up and take his head the way his father's had been taken. And where would such a rebellion start? In places where people gathered to discuss politics without supervision, in places where radical ideas could spread, in places where criticism of the government was not just tolerated but encouraged. In coffee houses, the official proclamation used careful language. It claimed that coffee houses had become centres of false, malicious and scandalous reports that defamed His Majesty's government. It argued that the constant spread of rumours and seditious talk in coffee houses was dangerous to the peace of the realm. It painted the coffee houses as breeding grounds for rebellion, as places where loyalty to the crown was undermined daily. And there was some truth to this. The coffee houses were full of political discussion, much of it critical of the government. People did spread rumours. They did question royal authority. They did, in the eyes of the monarchy, constitute a threat. But here is what the proclamation did not say. It did not mention that the coffeehouse culture had become too powerful for the crown to control. It did not admit that the free flow of information through coffeehouses made it impossible for the government to maintain its monopoly on truth. It did not acknowledge that once people tasted the freedom to think and speak for themselves, they could not be forced back into obedience. The reaction to the proclamation was immediate and volcanic, not just from coffeehouse owners who stood to lose their livelihoods, but from patrons across all social classes. Merchants protested that they conducted essential business in coffeehouses. Scholars argued that coffeehouses were vital to the advancement of learning. Even members of Parliament, many of whom frequented coffeehouses themselves, pushed back against the proclamation. Pamphlets appeared overnight, some anonymous, some daringly signed, all arguing against the closure. One pamphlet made a particularly powerful point. It argued that if coffeehouses were centres of sedition, then the proper response was to punish the seditious individuals, not to close the coffeehouses themselves. After all, seditious talk could happen anywhere. In taverns, in private homes, on street corners. Would the king ban all gathering places? Would he make it illegal for English citizens to speak to each other? The logic of the proclamation, the pamphlet argued, would lead to tyranny far worse than any threat posed by coffeehouse gossip. Another pamphlet took a different approach. It pointed out that coffeehouses generated significant tax revenue for the crown. Every coffeehouse paid licensing fees. They purchased taxed commodities like sugar and tobacco. They employed people who paid taxes. Closing the coffeehouses would hurt the royal treasury at a time when the government desperately needed money. This was a practical argument that probably carried more weight with some officials than any appeal to principles of free speech. But perhaps the most effective resistance came not from pamphlets, but from the simple reality of public opinion. The coffeehouses had become woven into the fabric of daily life in London and other English cities. Hundreds of thousands of people depended on them for business, for news, for social connection, for intellectual stimulation. The idea of suddenly shutting them all down was not just unpopular, it was unthinkable. It was as if someone today announced that the internet would be turned off permanently in 12 days. The disruption would be catastrophic, the anger would be overwhelming. And Charles II realised he had made a terrible mistake. He had underestimated how deeply the coffeehouses had become embedded in English life. He had miscalculated the political cost of trying to suppress them, and most importantly, he had revealed his own weakness. Because a truly powerful monarch does not need to ban coffeehouses. A truly powerful monarch is not threatened by people talking over cups of coffee. By issuing the proclamation, Charles admitted that he was afraid. that he felt his authority was fragile enough to be undermined by conversation. 11 days after the proclamation was issued, on January 8th, 1676, just 2 days before the closure was supposed to take effect, the king issued a second proclamation. This one was carefully worded to save face while completely reversing course. It suspended the closure order. It announced that coffee houses could remain open, but that owners must pledge not to allow seditious talk in their establishments, and must permit government officials to enter at any time to ensure compliance. This was presented as a compromise, as the king graciously relenting due to the petitions of his loyal subjects. But everyone understood what had really happened. The king had backed down. He had tried to assert absolute authority and had been forced to retreat by public pressure. It was a humiliating defeat, even if the official language tried to disguise it as royal mercy. And the coffee houses? They stayed open. Life continued as before. The political discussions resumed. The seditious gossip continued. Government informers did indeed visit coffee houses more frequently after this, trying to monitor what was being said. But the fundamental dynamic had not changed. The coffee houses remained spaces where people could speak with relative freedom, and the failed attempt to shut them down had paradoxically strengthened them, because now everyone knew that coffeehouse culture was powerful enough to defy a king. This moment is significant for reasons that extend far beyond coffeehouses. It represents one of the early battles in the long struggle for freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in England. The Glorious Revolution would come just a dozen years later, in 1688, when Parliament would force another king from the throne and establish that royal power was not absolute. The foundations for that revolution were laid in part by the coffeehouse crisis of 1675. Because the crisis proved that the public sphere, the space where ordinary people gathered to discuss ideas, had become strong enough to resist royal authority. Think about what this means for the development of democracy. Democracy requires more than just elections. It requires spaces where public opinion can form, where people can debate freely, where unpopular ideas can be expressed without immediate punishment. The coffee houses were those spaces, imperfect, exclusive, often chaotic, but nevertheless real. And when the Crown tried to destroy them and failed, it established a precedent. It demonstrated that once people have tasted freedom of expression, taking it away is not just difficult, it is impossible. There is a broad pattern here that repeats throughout history. Authoritarian governments always fear the spaces where people gather to talk freely. Whether it is coffee houses in 17th century England, salons in 18th century France, universities in 20th century dictatorships, or social media platforms today, the pattern is the same. When people can communicate freely and share information outside government control, that communication becomes a threat to centralized power. And authoritarian regimes always attempt to suppress it. Sometimes they succeed for a while, but in the long run, the human need for free expression and free association usually finds a way. The coffeehouse crisis also reveals something about the nature of social change. Change rarely happens through grand dramatic moments alone. It happens through the accumulation of small resistances. Every person who continued to go to coffeehouses despite the proclamation was resisting. Every pamphleteer who argued against the closure was resisting. Every merchant who petitioned Parliament was resisting. Individually, these acts might seem insignificant, but collectively, they became unstoppable. And there is one more aspect of this story that deserves attention. The failure of the proclamation changed how the government dealt with coffee houses going forward. Instead of trying to shut them down, officials shifted to a strategy of surveillance and licensing. They required coffee house owners to obtain licenses, which could be revoked if the owner permitted seditious behaviour. They sent informers to listen and report. They tried to control the coffee houses from within rather than abolishing them outright. This is often how power adapts when faced with resistance. It becomes more subtle, more invasive, but also more fragile. Have you ever seen a government or an institution try to suppress something only to make it more popular? The attempted ban on coffee houses had exactly that effect. After the crisis, coffee houses became even more politically significant than before. They were now symbols of resistance, of the right of ordinary people to gather and speak freely. The very act of going to a coffee house became, in a small way, a political statement. Roger North, a loyalist who supported the Crown, wrote bitterly about the coffee houses after the failed closure. He complained that sedition and treason, atheism, heresy and blasphemy were publicly taught in the celebrated coffee houses. He was not wrong exactly. Those things were discussed in coffee houses. But what North saw as proof of danger, others saw as proof of freedom. The fact that controversial ideas could be expressed openly, that authority could be questioned, that dogma could be challenged. This was not a bug of coffeehouse culture. It was the entire point. As you sit in the coffeehouse past midnight, you think about Charles II's failure. About what it must have felt like to be a king who issued a proclamation expecting obedience and instead got defiance. About the moment when he realized that his authority had limits, that there were forces in his kingdom stronger than royal decree. Did he understand that he was living through a transition, that the world of absolute monarchy was giving way to something new, something messier and more democratic? Or did he simply see it as a tactical retreat, a temporary setback? We cannot know what was in Charles's mind, but we know what happened afterward. The coffee houses thrived, the culture of free discourse continued to grow, and when his brother James II tried to rule as an absolute monarch a decade later, he was deposed. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 established parliamentary supremacy, and the intellectual groundwork for that revolution had been laid in large part in the coffee houses that Charles had tried and failed to close. There is a lesson here about power. Real power does not need to constantly assert itself. It does not need to ban and suppress and control every space where people gather. Real power is secure enough to allow dissent, to tolerate criticism, to let people speak freely, even when what they say is uncomfortable or challenging. Charles II did not have that kind of power. His authority was fragile, built on the memories of civil war and execution, and that fragility made him dangerous, but it also made him defeatable. The coffeehouse culture survived the king's attack, but it would not survive forever. Nothing does. And as we move towards dawn, as our long night in the coffeehouses approaches its end, we need to ask a difficult question. Why did this remarkable culture, this democratic experiment, this intellectual revolution, why did it fade away? What happened to the coffeehouses? Where did they go? And what replaced them? Because by the end of the 18th century, the golden age of the coffeehouse was over. The establishments we have visited tonight, the vibrant spaces full of debate and possibility, they were closing their doors. Some transformed into exclusive gentlemen's clubs, some became taverns, some simply disappeared. The next part of our journey explores that decline, the slow death of the penny universities, the reasons why tea conquered coffee, the way private clubs replaced public spaces, and what was lost when the coffeehouses faded into memory. Something is changing. You can feel it in the air, in the quality of the conversations, in the way people are starting to gather their coats and prepare to leave. It is past 1 a.m. now, deep into that strange liminal hour when the night transforms from excitement into exhaustion. The coffee house is still open, still serving, but the energy has shifted. Where there was vibrant debate an hour ago, now there is quieter conversation, the kind that happens when people are too tired for wit, but not quite ready to go home. And as you look around the room, you realize you are witnessing not just the end of a night, but the beginning of the end of an era. The golden age of the coffee house lasted roughly 100 years, from the 1650s to the 1750s, and then, slowly but inexorably, it faded. The coffee houses did not disappear overnight. Some remained open well into the 19th century, but they changed. They lost their magic, their centrality, their role as the engines of intellectual and social life. By 1800, the coffeehouse culture we have been exploring tonight was essentially dead. And the question is, why? What killed it? The answer, like most historical answers, is complicated. There was no single cause, but rather a convergence of factors, each one chipping away at the foundation of coffeehouse culture until the whole structure crumbled. Let me walk you through them, one by one, because understanding what was lost and why it was lost matters. It matters because we are facing similar questions today, about public spaces, about where and how we gather, about what happens when the places that once brought us together disappear. The first and most obvious factor was tea. Tea had been available in England since the mid-17th century, arriving around the same time as coffee. But initially, it was incredibly expensive, a luxury good affordable only to the very wealthy. A pound of tea in 1660 might cost more than a skilled worker earned in a month. So tea remained a curiosity, something exotic and rare, while coffee, being cheaper, became the beverage of the masses. But throughout the 18th century, the price of tea steadily declined. The British East India Company was expanding its operations in Asia, establishing tea plantations, negotiating trade deals, using its enormous political and military power to secure favourable terms. And as supply increased, prices fell. By the 1770s, tea was affordable for middle-class families. By the 1790s, even working-class people could afford tea regularly. And tea had advantages that coffee lacked. First, tea tasted better. This might seem like a minor point, but remember, 18th century coffee was truly awful. Burnt, bitter, full of grounds. Tea, on the other hand, could be delicate, fragrant, pleasant. Even people who had taught themselves to tolerate coffee preferred the taste of tea once they tried it. Second, tea could be prepared at home easily. Coffee required roasting beans, grinding them, boiling them. It was labour-intensive and produced inconsistent results. Tea just required pouring hot water over dried leaves. Anyone could do it. Third, and most importantly, tea was respectable for women. While coffee houses excluded women, tea gardens and tea rooms welcomed them. A woman could serve tea in her home, host a tea party, visit a tea garden with friends. Tea created social spaces that were accessible to both sexes. As tea became popular, coffee fell out of fashion. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, inevitably. Families who had bought coffee began buying tea instead. Coffee houses found their customer base shrinking, some adapted by serving tea alongside coffee. But that changed the character of the space. Tea drinkers wanted different things than coffee drinkers. They wanted quieter environments, less smoke, more gentility. The rough-and-tumble debate culture of the coffee houses did not fit with tea culture. And slowly, the coffee houses that tried to serve both ended up satisfying neither group. The numbers tell the story. In 1739, London had over 550 coffee houses. By 1800, that number had fallen to perhaps 100, and many of those were coffee houses in name only, having transformed into something else. The penny universities were closing their doors, but tea was not the only cause of decline. There was also what historians call the rise of snobbery. Remember, the original appeal of coffee houses was their democratic character. Anyone with a penny could enter. Class distinctions were supposed to dissolve. But as the 18th century progressed, The wealthy and educated classes became less comfortable with this arrangement. They began to feel that mixing with common tradesmen and workers was beneath their dignity. They wanted exclusive spaces where they could socialize only with people of their own class. And so gentlemen's clubs emerged. These were private establishments, membership only, expensive, carefully curated to exclude anyone deemed unsuitable. The clubs offered many of the same amenities as coffee houses: newspapers, comfortable seating, conversation, a place to conduct business. But they offered something coffee houses could not: exclusivity, status, the assurance that you would only meet people who were, in the language of the time, your equals. White's Club, Brooks's Club, Boodle's Club, these and many others were founded in the mid to late 18th century, and they drew away the wealthy patrons who had once frequented coffee houses. Some of these clubs actually evolved from coffee houses. White's, for instance, started as White's Chocolate House in 1693. But as it became more exclusive, charging membership fees and imposing social requirements, it stopped being a public coffee house and became a private club. This fragmentation of the coffeehouse audience was devastating. The whole point of coffeehouse culture was that it brought different classes together. A baron could sit next to a shoemaker, and both benefited from the exchange. But once the wealthy retreated into private clubs, that dynamic was broken. The coffeehouses that remained served primarily middle and working class customers. And while those spaces still had value, they no longer had the same influence, the same centrality in national life. The conversation that mattered, the deals that shaped the economy, the political discussions that influenced policy, those increasingly happened in exclusive clubs where ordinary people were not welcome. There is a bitter irony here. The coffee houses claimed to be egalitarian, but they never really were. They excluded women. They were uncomfortable for the poor. And ultimately, the wealthy decided that even the limited democracy of the coffee houses was too much. They wanted their old hierarchies back. They wanted spaces where everyone knew their place, and they got them. The clubs represented a retreat from the democratic experiment of the coffee houses, a return to the comfortable certainties of class stratification. The third factor in the decline was the evolution of print culture. Remember, one of the main functions of coffee houses was as distribution centers for news and information. Newspapers were expensive, so people went to coffee houses to read them. But as the 18th century progressed, newspapers became cheaper and more widely available. By the late 1700s, a working-class family could afford to subscribe to a weekly newspaper, not a daily perhaps, but enough to stay informed about major events. And this changed the calculus. If you could read the news at home, why go to a coffee house? Yes, you lost the conversation, the debate, the social aspect, but you gained privacy, convenience, and the ability to share the news with your family, including the women who were excluded from coffee houses. As home consumption of news increased, one of the core functions of coffee houses diminished. They were no longer the only place to get information. They were just one option among many. The expansion of print culture also included books, pamphlets, periodicals of all kinds. Lending libraries began to appear, making books accessible to people who could not afford to buy them. Literacy rates increased throughout the 18th century, especially among the middle classes. All of these developments were wonderful for the democratization of knowledge, but they made coffee houses less essential. You no longer needed to go to a coffee house to educate yourself. You could do it at home, with a book and a cup of tea. The fourth factor was government pressure. While King Charles II's attempt to shut down coffee houses had failed spectacularly, the government never stopped trying to control them. Licensing requirements became stricter. Fees increased. Penalties for allowing seditious conversation became harsher. Informers were everywhere, and the cumulative effect of this pressure was to make coffeehouse ownership riskier and less profitable. Many proprietors simply decided it was not worth the trouble. There was also the coffeehouse keeper's proposal of 1728, a bizarre attempt by coffeehouse owners to establish a monopoly over news distribution. The owners proposed that only coffeehouses should be allowed to sell newspapers and that all other sales should be prohibited. They argued this would preserve their business model and ensure that coffeehouses remained centres of information exchange. But the proposal was met with ridicule and fierce opposition. Critics pointed out that it would create a censorship system, giving coffeehouse owners enormous power over what information the public could access. The proposal failed, but the fact that it was even suggested shows how desperate coffeehouse owners had become. They knew their business model was failing and they were grasping at increasingly absurd solutions. Edward Bramah, a historian of coffee, argues that this failed proposal marked a turning point. After 1728, coffeehouse owners lost public sympathy. They were no longer seen as champions of free discourse, but as self-interested businessmen trying to protect their profits through anti-competitive practices. The reputation of coffeehouses suffered, and that reputational damage contributed to their decline. There is a fifth factor that is harder to measure, but perhaps most important. The culture changed. The generation that had fought for the right to gather in coffeehouses, that had defied King Charles, that had built the penny universities, that generation died. Their children and grandchildren did not have the same attachment to coffeehouse culture. For them, coffeehouses were just places to drink coffee, not symbols of freedom and intellectual vitality. The revolutionary energy had dissipated. The sense that something new and important was happening in these spaces had faded into routine. This is how cultural institutions die. Not usually through dramatic events, but through slow erosion. Each generation cares a little less. Each year the spaces seem a little less essential. The habits change, the passion dims, and one day you realize that something that once seemed permanent and vital has simply vanished. By the early 19th century, the coffeehouses that remained were either specialized business establishments like Lloyd's, which had essentially become an insurance exchange rather than a coffeehouse, or they were working-class gathering places with little of the intellectual fervour of their predecessors. The penny universities were gone, the space where a shoemaker could debate a baron, where poets launched their careers, where news circulated at lightning speed, where the future was argued into existence over cups of terrible coffee. That space no longer existed. And what replaced it? Private clubs for the wealthy, taverns and pubs for everyone else, and increasingly the home. The 19th century saw the rise of domestic ideology, the idea that the home was the proper centre of life, especially for women. The public sphere contracted, people withdrew into private spaces, and something important was lost. Have you ever watched a place you loved slowly fade away? Maybe a favourite bookstore that closed, a restaurant that went out of business, a community centre that lost its funding. That feeling of loss, of knowing that a space that once brought people together is gone and will not return, that is what the decline of the coffeehouses represents. Except on a civilizational scale. An entire culture of public intellectual discourse, imperfect but real, vanished. And we are still dealing with the consequences. The clock shows 1:30, the candles have burned low. Outside, the streets are nearly empty. The few people still awake are either those with nowhere else to go, or those like us, who are bearing witness to something ending, because every night ends, every era ends, every golden age fades into memory. The coffeehouses had their moment, their century of glory, and then they passed into history. But they left something behind. They left the idea that ordinary people have the right to gather, to speak freely, to educate themselves, to participate in the great conversations that shape society. That idea did not die with the coffee houses. It transformed. It found new expressions. It lives on. And now, as dawn approaches, as our long night in the coffee houses draws to a close, we have one more question to answer. What does all of this mean? Why does it matter that 300 years ago people gathered in small rooms to drink terrible coffee and argue about everything? What is the legacy of the coffee houses? What did they teach us? And what do they tell us about our own time, our own struggles, our own need for spaces where we can come together and be heard? In the final part of our journey, we step back out into the streets as the first light of dawn touches the rooftops of London, and we try to understand what we have witnessed, what it meant then, and what it might mean for us now. The door of the coffee house creaks open one last time, and you step out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air is cold and sharp, shocking after the warmth and smoke inside. Your eyes, adjusted to candlelight, struggle with the deeper darkness of the street. But as you stand there, letting your senses recalibrate, you notice something. The sky to the east is no longer completely black. There is the faintest suggestion of grey, the barest hint that somewhere beyond the rooftops and chimneys, the sun is preparing to rise. You have spent the entire night in the coffee houses of 18th century London. And now, as that world fades with the darkness, it is time to ask what it all meant. We are standing in Change Alley, the same narrow passage where we began our journey 7 hours ago. But everything looks different now. The frenetic energy is gone. The alley is empty except for a man sweeping the cobblestones in front of a shop preparing for the day's business. The ghosts of all the conversations, all the deals, all the arguments that happened here have dissolved into the cold morning air, and yet they are still here. If you know where to look, walk with me. Just a short distance to the spot where Jonathan's coffee house once stood. There is a plaque on the wall, placed there in the 20th century by people who understood that something important happened in this place. The plaque commemorates Jonathan's as the birthplace of the London Stock Exchange. It is accurate as far as it goes, but it tells only part of the story. Yes, the stock exchange was born here, but so was something more fundamental. The idea that ordinary people could participate in the economy, in politics, in the intellectual life of the nation. The idea that you did not need to be born into the right family or attend the right schools to matter. The idea that a penny could buy you not just coffee, but a voice. Now walk with me to Lombard Street, to the site where Lloyd's Coffee House once served sailors and merchants. The building is long gone, replaced by modern structures, but Lloyd's of London still exists, now housed in a striking modern building designed by Richard Rogers, all exposed pipes and inside-out architecture. It's one of the largest insurance markets in the world, facilitating trillions of dollars in coverage every year. Ships, planes, satellites, oil rigs, even celebrity body parts. All insured through a market that began with Edward Lloyd taking notes about ship movements and serving coffee to captains. The scale has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Information is power. Trust is valuable, and the institutions that provide both will endure. Walk with me to Covent Garden, to the corner where Moll King's coffee house welcomed the desperate and the criminal. That building is gone too, replaced many times over. Now it is part of a tourist district full of expensive restaurants and street performers. The market traders still come, but they sell artisanal cheese and organic vegetables to wealthy Londoners, not rough produce to working-class families. The prostitutes and pickpockets have been displaced elsewhere, pushed to the margins of a city that prefers to pretend they do not exist. But they do exist. Poverty and desperation have not been solved, they have just been made less visible. Moll King's legacy is the uncomfortable reminder that for every enlightened coffee-drinking philosopher, There were a dozen people struggling to survive, finding community in the shadows. The coffee houses are gone, but their legacy remains. And that legacy is complicated, just like the coffee houses themselves were complicated. Let me try to untangle it to understand what we inherited from those smoke-filled rooms where terrible coffee fueled brilliant conversations. First, the coffee houses helped create the public sphere. This is a term coined by the philosopher Jürgen Habermas in the 20th century, but it describes something that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. The public sphere is the space between the government and the private home, where citizens gather to discuss matters of common concern. It is where public opinion forms, where ideas circulate, where movements begin. Before the coffee houses, this space barely existed in England. You had the royal court, which was not public in any meaningful sense, and you had private homes, which were not communal. The coffee houses created something in between, a place that was public but not governmental, communal but not domestic, and once that space existed, it changed everything. It made democracy possible in a way it had not been before. Second, the coffee houses democratized information. For the first time in history, ordinary people had access to news from around the world, delivered almost in real time. They could read multiple perspectives, they could compare sources, they could develop the critical thinking skills necessary to navigate a complex information landscape. Does this sound familiar? The challenges we face today with social media, with distinguishing truth from fiction, with information overload and filter bubbles, these are not new challenges. They are the same challenges the coffeehouse patrons faced 300 years ago, and the solutions they developed, the habits of mind they cultivated, those are still relevant. Cross-reference your sources. Consider the bias of the messenger. Seek out multiple perspectives. These are lessons from the penny universities that we desperately need today. Third, the coffee houses proved that intellectual culture did not need to be confined to elite institutions. You did not need to go to Oxford or Cambridge to engage with ideas. You just needed curiosity and a penny. This was revolutionary. And while the coffee houses themselves faded, the principle they established lived on. Public libraries, adult education programs, free online courses, these are all descendants of the penny university idea. The notion that knowledge should be accessible to everyone, that education is a right, not a privilege, that has its roots in the coffeehouse culture. Fourth, the coffeehouses demonstrated the power of physical gathering spaces. There is something about being in the same room with other people, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, that cannot be replicated digitally. The coffeehouses were not just about the exchange of information, they were about the creation of community, about the serendipitous conversations that happen when different people with different backgrounds collide, about the way ideas spark and combine when people are physically present with each other. We are learning this lesson again today, as we realize that Zoom meetings and online forums, valuable as they are, cannot fully replace the experience of gathering in person. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the coffee houses taught us that once people taste freedom, they will fight to keep it. When King Charles tried to shut down the coffee houses, the public rose up. They understood instinctively that something precious was at stake. The freedom to gather, to speak, to question authority, to think for yourself. These freedoms, once experienced, become non-negotiable. This is a lesson that every generation must relearn. Freedom is not given, it is ta'en, and it must be defended constantly against those who would restrict it for their own purposes. But the legacy of the coffee houses is not entirely positive. We must also acknowledge what they failed to do, what they excluded, what they got wrong. They claimed to be egalitarian but excluded women and were uncomfortable for the poor. They claimed to value truth but spread as much rumour as fact. They claimed to promote enlightenment but were deeply entangled with slavery and empire. The coffee houses were products of their time, and their time was one of profound injustice and inequality. We can admire what they achieved while also recognizing their failures. In fact, we must, because understanding those failures helps us avoid repeating them. The sky is lighter now. You can see the outlines of buildings, the details of cobblestones, the faces of the few other people who are awake at this hour. The night is ending, and as it ends, you feel a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude for having witnessed something remarkable, sadness that it is gone, but also perhaps hope. Because the story does not end here. The coffee houses may have faded, but the hunger they satisfied has not. We still need spaces where we can gather and talk freely. We still need access to information and education. We still need communities that bring together people from different backgrounds. We still need the freedom to question, to debate, to think for ourselves. These needs are as urgent today as they were in 1750. The technology has changed, the spaces have changed, but the fundamental human needs remain the same. Look around London today, or any major city, and you will see the descendants of the coffee houses. Modern coffee shops, yes, though most of them are corporate chains that bear little resemblance to the original coffee houses, but also community centres, libraries, universities that now admit everyone regardless of class or gender, online forums where people gather to discuss ideas, activist spaces where movements are born. The spirit of the coffee houses lives on in all of these places, imperfectly, incompletely, but recognizably. And perhaps most importantly, it lives on in us, in our expectation that we have the right to speak freely, to access information, to participate in public discourse. These expectations, which feel so natural to us now, were forged in the coffee houses. They were radical ideas once. They were fought for. People risked their livelihoods and sometimes their lives to defend them, and we inherited the world those people created. So as the sun breaks over the rooftops of London, as the city begins to wake and the streets fill with people rushing to their daily business, take a moment to remember. Remember the coffee houses. Remember the shoemaker who debated philosophy with a baron. Remember the runners carrying news from coffee house to coffee house. Remember Edward Lloyd taking notes about ships. Remember John Dryden holding court by the window. Remember Moll King creating refuge for the desperate. Remember the women who stood outside, excluded but not defeated. Remember King Charles issuing his proclamation and then being forced to back down. Remember all of it, the glory and the shame, the brilliance and the cruelty, the democracy and the exclusion. Because these were real people, living real lives, making real choices that shaped the world we inherited. They were not saints, they were not villains. They were human beings, stumbling towards something better, making mistakes along the way, but creating spaces of possibility that had not existed before. And the question for us is, what spaces are we creating? What possibilities are we opening up? What will future generations say about the choices we made, the communities we built, the freedoms we defended or failed to defend? The coffee house is empty now, the candles have burned out, the last patron has gone home, but the conversations continue. They continue in different spaces, in different forms, in different centuries. The great conversation of humanity about who we are and what we owe each other and how we should live together, that conversation never ends. It just moves from place to place, generation to generation. The coffee houses had their turn, they played their part, and now it is our turn. Thank you for spending this night with me, walking through the coffee houses of 18th century London, meeting the people who gathered there, understanding what they created and what they lost. I hope you found something in this story that resonates with your own life, your own struggles, your own search for community and meaning. History is not just about the past. It is about understanding ourselves, understanding where we came from and where we might be going. And sometimes the best way to see the present clearly is to step back into the past and look at our world through different eyes. The sun is up now. The night is over. It is time to return to the present, to your own life, to your own challenges and joys. But maybe, just maybe, you will carry something from this night with you. A sense of what is possible when people gather. A reminder that change is always happening, that nothing is permanent, that every age has its own struggles and its own victories. A conviction that space is where people can speak freely matter, that they are worth creating and worth defending. A recognition that we are all a part of a long story, that what we do today will be history tomorrow, and that the choices we make echo forward in ways we cannot fully predict. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through this long, strange, beautiful night in the coffee houses. If you enjoyed this journey through history, I would be grateful if you would share it with others who might appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me what surprised you most, what made you think, what you will remember, and please subscribe to the channel because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more nights to spend in the past, learning from those who came before us, trying to understand what it all means. The coffee houses are gone, but their ghosts remain, whispering to us about freedom and community and the power of ordinary people gathering together to talk. Listen to those whispers, honour them, and perhaps in your own life, in your own way, keep the spirit of the penny universities alive, because the world needs spaces where anyone can enter, where all are welcome, where ideas flow freely, and where the price of admission is just the willingness to listen and learn. Until we meet again, in another time, another place, another story. Good night, or rather good morning. The night is over, the story continues, and somewhere in some corner of the world people are gathering even now to drink something warm and argue about everything that matters. The coffee houses may be gone, but the conversation goes on. It always does. It always will.